My name is Abby. I am 34 years old, and I was standing in a Chicago courtroom watching my own family try to erase my sanity and steal my life. I had survived a sniper bullet in Syria, but nothing prepared me for the betrayal waiting at home. My sister-in-law, a woman who prided herself on her powerful political connections, smiled as the judge ordered me to strip the Navy Cross from my uniform. She thought she had won my $4 million inheritance. She had no idea that the small black flash drive in my pocket was about to destroy her entire empire and send the judge straight to federal prison. If you have ever had to smile while toxic family members tried to destroy you, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe to hear how I burned their lies to the ground. Miss Mitchell, remove that metal from your lapel immediately. The heavy wooden gavel slammed against the sounding block, echoing through the sterile courtroom. Judge Thomas Arrington glared down at me from his elevated bench, his face twisted in absolute disgust. This is a court of law, not a community theater for your stolen valor act. I will not have you parading around in fake military honors to manipulate this proceeding. I stood completely still. Less than 10 feet away, sitting at the plaintiff table, was my sister-in-law, Kendra. She adjusted the sleeves of her tailored designer blazer and offered me a sickeningly sweet, victorious smirk. Kendra came from a prominent African-American family, deeply rooted in Chicago real estate and local politics. She possessed old money, vast influence, and a ruthless need for absolute control over everyone in her orbit. Sitting right next to her, staring intently at his own shoes, was my older brother, Derek. The man I had shared my childhood with could not even muster the courage to look me in the eye while his wife tried to legally declare me insane. Kendra's attorney, a man whose hourly rate probably cost more than my first vehicle, stood up and buttoned his jacket. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of erratic, delusional behavior we outlined in our petition. My client, Mrs. Montgomery Mitchell, is simply trying to save her sister-in-law from herself. Abigail suffers from severe, unmanaged combat trauma. She was discharged from the military, and now she lives in a fantasy world where she believes she is a decorated war hero. It is tragic, truly, but allowing a woman in this state of severe psychosis to retain control over a $4 million financial trust is not just irresponsible, it is incredibly dangerous. We are respectfully asking the court to grant Kendra full conservatorship immediately to protect those assets from being squandered. My hands did not shake. My breathing did not accelerate. Years of treating wounded Marines under heavy artillery fire as a Navy corpsman had taught me exactly how to compartmentalize panic. I reached up to the lapel of my navy blue suit and carefully unclasped the heavy bronze cross. I felt the sharp pin against my thumb as I pulled it free, a grounding sensation of physical reality amidst a room full of absolute fiction. You paid this man $50,000 just to declare me incompetent, Kendra. My voice cut through the silence of the courtroom, steady and resonant. I did not yell. I did not need to. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my sister-in-law, ignoring the lawyer entirely. Or is this sudden, deep concern for my mental health simply because grandfather left the entire $4 million trust to me instead of Derek? Kendra scoffed, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms defensively. Do not do this to yourself, Abby. You are sick. We are trying to get you the psychiatric help you desperately need before you hurt someone or end up homeless on the streets. Help! I stepped out from behind the defense table. I was representing myself, a choice that had made Judge Arrington openly laugh at me just an hour prior. Is that what you call cornering Derek the day after our father died and forcing him to kick me out of my childhood home? Because you were terrified I would ask for my rightful share of the property. You do not care about my mental health. You care that your family's supposedly untouchable real estate empire is suddenly bleeding cash, and you are absolutely desperate to use my inheritance to plug the holes before the federal government notices. Objection! Kendra's lawyer shouted, his face reddening as he slammed his hand on the table. The respondent is spiraling into paranoid conspiracies again. This is entirely irrelevant to the certified medical evaluation we provided to the court. Sustained. Judge Arrington barked, pointing a thick finger directly at me. Miss Mitchell, I warned you about these outbursts. Your reckless accusations only prove the petitioner's point. You are clearly unwell and losing your grip on reality. I have read the psychiatric evaluation provided by Dr. Thorne. It paints a very disturbing picture of your mental faculties. If you speak out of turn one more time, I will hold you in contempt and have the bailiffs restrain you. Now place that fake piece of metal on the evidence table and step back. I walked slowly toward the center table. The room was suffocatingly quiet. I could feel Derek shifting uncomfortably in his seat, the guilt radiating off him in waves. But he remained a silent coward to the very end, too afraid of losing his lavish lifestyle to defend his own sister. I looked up at the judge, taking in his arrogant posture, the way he looked down at me like an insect he was preparing to crush under his shoe. I will gladly comply with your order, Your Honor, I said, placing the bronze Navy cross gently onto the polished wood. But as I pulled my hand back, I let a second object slip from my palm. A sleek black encrypted USB drive landed right next to the metal with a sharp metallic clink. Kendra frowned, leaning forward slightly, her perfect posture breaking as she tried to see what I had dropped. The judge narrowed his eyes, clearly annoyed by the theatrical delay. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. I stood up straight, squaring my shoulders, letting the disciplined posture of my military training take over. As a forensic financial investigator, I have learned that people can fake psychiatric evaluations. They can fake familial concern. And they can certainly fake their own wealth. But numbers never lie. Before you sign away my financial autonomy and my freedom, do you want to see the evidence I just submitted to the court clerk this morning? Because I promise you, what is on that drive is going to change everything. To understand how I ended up staring down a corrupt judge with a flash drive that held the power to ruin him, you have to go back exactly 72 hours. The absolute betrayal that landed me in that courtroom began at a Thanksgiving dinner table in a lavish Chicago penthouse. The penthouse belonged to my brother Derek and his wife Kendra. It was a sprawling multi-million-dollar property overlooking Lake Michigan, paid for entirely by Kendra's family. The Montgomery family was a powerhouse in Chicago real estate and local politics. Kendra never let anyone forget it. She was an impeccably dressed, highly educated African-American woman who carried herself like royalty, demanding absolute submission from everyone in her home. My brother Derek had married into her wealth 5 years ago, trading his dignity for designer suits and a luxury lifestyle he could never earn on his own. The dinner had been suffocating from the start. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were fawning over Kendra complimenting her expensive china and the catered holiday spread. I sat quietly at the end of the table, sipping sparkling water, waiting for the evening to end. I had only attended because it was the first Thanksgiving since our grandfather passed away. Grandfather was the only person in our family who saw through Derek's laziness and my parents' superficial greed. When his will was read 2 months prior, the family was shocked to learn he had bypassed Derek entirely. He left his entire $4 million liquid trust to me. He knew I had discipline. I had served in the military, saved lives as a Navy corpsman, and built a solid career as a forensic accountant. He knew the money would be safe with me. Kendra had been furious ever since. Right as the catered turkey was being carved, the trap was sprung. Kendra stood up from her chair. She did not offer a toast. Instead, she reached onto the sideboard, picked up a thick manila folder, and dropped it right onto my dinner plate. The heavy thud silenced the entire room. I looked down at the folder, then up at her. "What is this, Kendra?" She smiled, a cold, calculated expression that made my military instincts flare. "It is a psychiatric evaluation, Abby, signed by a top medical professional in the city. As a prominent Black family in the city, the Montgomerys cannot be associated with a loose cannon. Your military trauma makes you a liability. Your behavior has been erratic. We are filing an emergency petition for a conservatorship tomorrow morning to manage your $4 million trust. We cannot let a sick woman squander a family fortune." I opened the folder. My eyes scanned the documents. It was a formal psychiatric diagnosis, claiming I suffered from severe, violent, and unmanaged post-traumatic stress disorder. It claimed I was a danger to myself and others. It was signed by a Dr. Eris Thorne. I had never met a Dr. Eris Thorne in my entire life. I looked across the table at Derek. His face was pale. He was staring intensely at his wine glass, refusing to meet my gaze. "You let your wife buy a fake medical diagnosis to steal my inheritance?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "You are going to let her legally declare me insane so you can take control of my bank accounts." My father, Richard, slammed his fist on the table, rattling the expensive silverware. "Do not embarrass your brother, Abby. Kendra is doing you a favor. Her family has power and resources in Chicago that you do not understand. You have always been unstable, running off to a war zone instead of settling down. Just sign the consent forms. Let Kendra and Derek manage the money. It is the best thing for everyone." My mother, Patricia, chimed in immediately, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. "We are only thinking of your well-being, darling. You do not know how to handle $4 million. Kendra has financial advisors. Just cooperate. Do not make this ugly." I sat there surrounded by the people who were supposed to be my blood, listening to them eagerly sell me out to a wealthy tyrant. They were not trying to help me. They were trying to strip away my fundamental human rights. A conservatorship meant I would lose control of my finances, my medical decisions, and my freedom. I would be legally reduced to the status of a child permanently trapped under Kendra's thumb. I looked at the legal consent forms attached to the back of the fake medical evaluation. There was a pen resting right beside my plate. Kendra pointed to the bottom line. "Sign it, Abby. If you make us take this to court, it will be a public spectacle. The judge will look at your combat record, look at this doctor's evaluation, and lock you in a ward. Do the smart thing." My mind raced. Complaining would do nothing. Screaming at them would only play into their narrative that I was unstable. I was a forensic financial investigator. I hunted hidden assets and corporate fraud for a living. I knew that people like Kendra did not orchestrate elaborate, highly illegal schemes just for the fun of it. Wealthy people do not risk federal perjury charges unless they are absolutely desperate for cash. Something was wrong with the Montgomery Empire, and I needed to know exactly what it was. I closed the folder and stood up slowly. I pushed my chair back, keeping my movements deliberate and controlled. I am not signing anything, I said, maintaining direct eye contact with Kendra. And I am leaving. Derek finally looked up, panic flashing in his eyes. "Abby, wait. You cannot just leave. We have already filed the preliminary paperwork. The police can force a medical hold if you act erratic." I ignored him. I turned my back on the dining table and walked down the long, art-filled hallway of their penthouse. I heard Kendra shouting behind me, telling my father to stop me from leaving the apartment. I walked toward the front foyer where the coats were kept, but I did not stop there. I knew Derek's habits. I knew that whenever they hosted these lavish family dinners, he retreated to his private home office to escape his wife's overbearing presence. I knew he was careless with his digital security. I took a sharp right turn down the guest corridor. I reached the heavy oak door of Derek's private office, turned the brass knob, and slipped inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the glowing screen of his laptop resting on the mahogany desk. I closed the door behind me and threw the deadbolt, locking myself in. The real war was about to begin. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing me inside the dark office. The only light came from the glowing screen of Derek's laptop resting on the mahogany desk. I took a deep breath, letting the muffled sounds of Kendra shouting in the hallway fade into the background. I did not have much time. I walked over to the desk and tapped the spacebar. The screen woke up, demanding a password. I pulled my specialized encrypted flash drive from my pocket. As a forensic financial investigator, I carried software that could bypass most commercial security systems, but looking at the password prompt, I realized I probably did not even need it. My brother was a creature of incredibly lazy habits. While I had spent my entire life fighting for every scrap of respect, studying late into the night, and pushing myself through brutal military training, Derek had coasted on minimal effort. He always took the path of least resistance. I typed in the name of his childhood golden retriever, followed by his high school graduation year. The screen instantly unlocked. It was pathetic, really. A man who claimed he was responsible enough to manage a $4 million trust could not even be bothered to update his digital security in over a decade. I plugged my flash drive into the port and ran a discrete extraction program. I bypassed his personal files and went straight for the shared network drives. Derek was an executive vice president at the Montgomery Real Estate Group, a title Kendra had simply handed to him on their wedding day. I knew he would have access to the master ledgers. My fingers flew across the keyboard opening spreadsheets, tax returns, and internal bank statements. What I saw made my blood run cold. The Montgomery family projected an image of untouchable generational wealth. They hosted charity galas, funded political campaigns, and flaunted their billionaire status across Chicago. But the numbers told a completely different story. I pulled up the internal accounting for their flagship charity foundation and cross-referenced it with their commercial property holdings. It was a massive, fragile house of cards. They had been over-leveraging properties to pay off other loans, effectively running a high-end Ponzi scheme through dummy corporations. I kept digging, following the rapid flow of hidden liabilities, until I hit the mother lode. It was a highly confidential notice from the Internal Revenue Service. The Montgomerys were currently under a covert federal audit. They owed $12 million in back taxes, corporate fraud penalties, and unpaid capital gains. If they did not pay a massive chunk of that debt within the next 30 days, the federal government was going to freeze their assets and hand down federal indictments. The sheer panic in the numbers was obvious. They were entirely illiquid. Their assets were tied up in underwater mortgages and failing commercial spaces. They were broke, desperate, and facing years in federal prison. Suddenly, the fake psychiatric evaluation they had thrown at me during dinner made perfect sense. They did not care about my mental health. They did not even care about controlling my life choices. They were backed into a corner staring down federal prosecution, and I had just inherited a $4 million liquid trust from our grandfather. If they could successfully declare me legally incompetent, Derek would be granted full conservatorship over my finances as my next of kin. They would instantly drain my accounts to pay off the IRS, saving the Montgomery Empire and leaving me penniless and trapped in a psychiatric ward. My own brother was willing to strip away my basic human rights and lock me in a hospital just to cover his wealthy wife's tax fraud. Disgust washed over me, replacing any lingering sense of familial loyalty. I was no longer dealing with family. I was dealing with hostile combatants. I quickly copied the master ledgers, the IRS notices, and the shadow account records onto my encrypted flash drive. The progress bar crept toward 100%. Every second felt like an hour. I kept my eyes on the door, listening to the heavy footsteps pacing furiously outside. Just as the transfer completed and I safely ejected the drive, the brass doorknob beside me rattled violently. The heavy wood shook as someone threw their weight against it. "I know you are in there, you psycho!" Kendra hissed from the other side, her voice completely stripped of its usual refined elegance. "Open this door right now, or I am calling the police and telling them you have a weapon." I stepped back from the mahogany desk, slipping the encrypted flash drive into the palm of my hand. The heavy oak door shuddered again. Through the frosted glass panels flanking the brass doorknob, I could see the distorted shadow of my sister-in-law pacing like a caged predator. I did not say a word. I knew that any response, any raised voice would immediately be recorded or twisted to fit the narrative of the unhinged combat veteran they were trying to build. I simply watched the shadow raise something large and heavy. A tremendous crash shattered the silence of the penthouse. Shards of thick frosted glass exploded inward, raining across the Persian rug. Kendra had grabbed a massive marble vase from the hallway console and swung it directly through the door panel. She reached her hand through the jagged opening, flipped the deadbolt, and pushed the door wide open. But she did not attack me. Instead, Kendra looked at me with a chilling, calculated smile. She bent down and picked up a sharp 6-inch shard of broken glass from the door frame. Without breaking eye contact with me, Kendra dragged the sharp edge across her own left forearm, slicing through her expensive silk blouse. Blood immediately welled up, spilling over her wrist and dripping onto the hardwood floor. She dropped the bloody glass shard right at my feet. Then she opened her mouth and unleashed a blood-curdling, terrified scream. "Help me! Somebody help me!" "She has a weapon," Kendra shrieked, clutching her bleeding arm as she backed away into the hallway. Her performance was flawless. She stumbled against the wall, hyperventilating, painting a picture of absolute terror. I stood in the center of the office, completely still. My military training overrode the initial shock of her psychotic display. I assessed the tactical situation instantly. I was trapped in a room with broken glass, a bleeding woman, and a family that desperately needed me to look like a violent threat. If I moved toward her to offer first aid, it would look like an attack. If I ran, it would look like guilt. I stayed perfectly planted, keeping my hands visible at my sides. Seconds later, the pounding of heavy boots echoed down the corridor. Two private security guards from the luxury building rushed in, followed almost immediately by three Chicago police officers, with their hands resting on their holstered weapons. Kendra must have silently triggered the penthouse panic alarm the moment she realized I was locked inside the office. "Drop the weapon and put your hands where I can see them," the lead officer barked, stepping into the doorway and positioning himself between me and Kendra. "I have no weapon, officer," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and modulated. I slowly raised both of my empty hands to shoulder height. "I am unarmed." Kendra collapsed against the hallway wall, sobbing hysterically into the arms of a female officer. "She went crazy." Kendra gasped, her voice trembling perfectly. "I came in to check on her because she was acting erratic at dinner. She just snapped. She smashed the door glass and came at me with a jagged piece. Look at my arm. She is a combat veteran. She has severe trauma. She kept screaming that she was going to kill us all." I looked past the police officers. My brother Derek and my parents Richard and Patricia were huddled at the end of the hallway. The lead police officer turned to them. "Is this true? Did you witness her acting aggressively?" Derek looked at his wife's bleeding arm, then at the police. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He knew I had never touched her, but he also knew about the $12 million IRS debt I had just uncovered on his laptop. He made his choice. "Yes," Derek lied, his voice shaking. "My sister has violent trauma. We brought her here for Thanksgiving to stage a medical intervention. We tried to get her to sign commitment papers for her own good, but she lost her mind and locked herself in my office. When my wife tried to coax her out, she attacked." "She is sick, officer," my mother added, playing the tragic, heartbroken parent perfectly. "She needs to be locked up before she kills someone. Please, just take her to a hospital. We have been living in fear of her for months." The betrayal was absolute. My own flesh and blood were standing 10 feet away, handing me over to the authorities on fabricated assault charges, just to protect a failing real estate empire. The lead officer unclipped his metal handcuffs and stepped toward me. "Miss, turn around and face the wall. Interlock your fingers behind your head." "I am complying, officer," I stated clearly. I turned slowly. As I pivoted, I intentionally stumbled just a fraction of an inch, letting my knee buckle slightly, as if I had lost my footing on the slick hardwood floor. In that split second, out of the line of sight of the officers behind me, I dropped the black encrypted flash drive from my palm. With a swift, practiced movement of my foot, I kicked the drive straight into the deep collar of my tactical boot, letting it slide securely beneath my ankle. By the time I placed my hands behind my head, the digital key to the Montgomery family's destruction was safely hidden on my person. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped tight around my wrists. The officer patted me down quickly, finding nothing but my wallet and my car keys. No weapons, no sharp glass. But the narrative had already been set, and in a high-end Chicago penthouse, with a bleeding wealthy socialite pointing the finger, the truth did not matter to the police. "Abigail Mitchell, you are under arrest for aggravated assault," the officer stated as he marched me toward the door. Kendra peeked out from behind the paramedic who was now bandaging her self-inflicted wound. The terrified, sobbing victim facade vanished for a fraction of a second. She shot me a cold, dead-eyed smirk. She thought she had won. She thought she had neutralized the threat and secured her path to my $4 million trust. "We are not taking her to the precinct," a second officer said, looking at a clipboard handed to him by Derek. The brother just provided a signed psychiatric evaluation from a Dr. Eris Thorne, declaring her an immediate danger to society. The lead officer nodded, tightening his grip on my arm. "Change of plans, Miss Mitchell. Given your combat history and this medical directive, we are bypassing the holding cell. We are taking you straight to the psychiatric ward on a 72-hour involuntary medical hold." The heavy metal doors of the psychiatric wing locked behind me with a loud hollow thud that echoed down the sterile corridor. The police officers handed my custody paperwork to the intake staff at the front desk and walked away without looking back. I was led down a brightly lit hallway that smelled sharply of bleach and floor wax. Two orderlies pointed me toward a small windowless changing room and handed me a set of scratchy paper hospital scrubs. They instructed me to remove my civilian clothes so they could be inventoried and locked away. I knew the protocol. I knew they would search every pocket and seam of my clothing. As soon as the changing room door clicked shut, I quickly reached into my tactical boot and retrieved the black encrypted flash drive. It was the only piece of leverage I had left in the world. I slipped out of my navy blue suit and pulled on the flimsy paper pants. I unrolled the thick elastic waistband, tucked the small drive tightly into the fold against my bare skin, and rolled the waistband securely back over it. It was completely invisible. I handed my folded clothes through the door to the orderly, keeping my posture relaxed and compliant. They placed me in an isolation room with pale green walls and a single mattress bolted directly to the linoleum floor. The heavy door locked from the outside. I did not pace. I did not cry. I sat perfectly still in the dead center of the mattress, crossed my legs, and regulated my breathing. My military training took over, slowing my heart rate. I was a prisoner, but I was not a victim. I knew they would send someone to break me, and I needed a clear head for the fight. 2 hours later, the heavy door swung open. A tall man in a tailored charcoal suit beneath a pristine white lab coat walked into the room. His silver name badge read Dr. Eris Thorne. He carried a metal clipboard and a small plastic cup containing 2 heavy white pills. A broad-shouldered male night nurse stepped in behind him, remaining silently by the doorframe. Dr. Thorne looked down at me with a condescending, predatory smile. "Abigail Mitchell," he said, his voice dripping with fake, manufactured sympathy. "You have had a very rough night. Your sister-in-law is absolutely terrified. Your brother is heartbroken. You suffered a severe psychotic break at the dinner table." I did not break eye contact. "I am completely lucid, Dr. Thorne. And you and I both know I never attacked anyone." Thorne chuckled softly, stepping closer to the mattress. He set the clipboard down next to my knee. "This is the tragic reality of combat trauma, Abby. You washed out of the Navy, you came home a broken woman, and now you are a danger to society. Your brain simply cannot separate reality from the war zone. But there is a way out of this room. Kendra Montgomery is incredibly generous. She is willing to fund your long-term care in a beautiful private psychiatric facility. But you need to cooperate." He picked up the plastic cup and held it out to me. "Take these pills. Calm your mind. Tomorrow morning when the court-appointed lawyer arrives, sign the conservatorship consent forms, letting your brother manage your trust fund. If you do that, I will sign a medical release stating your medication is working and you are compliant. If you refuse, I will testify before a judge that you are hopelessly schizophrenic and need to be committed to a state hospital indefinitely." I looked at the pills in the cup, then slowly looked back up at his arrogant face. "Lorazepam," I stated flatly. 2 milligrams each. A heavy central nervous system depressant used for acute panic attacks. You are attempting to chemically restrain a patient who is presenting 0 signs of physical or verbal agitation. Under the Illinois Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities Code, administering psychotropic medication without informed consent to a nonviolent patient is a direct violation of my civil rights. Dr. Thorne stopped smiling. His jaw tightened as the fake sympathy vanished from his eyes. I did not stop. Furthermore, writing a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation for financial gain constitutes medical malpractice, conspiracy, and federal wire fraud. And for the record, Dr. Thorne, I did not wash out of the Navy. I am a trained Navy corpsman. I was honorably discharged. I took a sniper round to my left shoulder while pulling a bleeding Marine out of a burning transport vehicle in Syria. That is why the Secretary of the Navy pinned the Navy Cross on my uniform. You are completely out of your depth, and you picked the wrong combat veteran to gaslight. Thorne snatched the plastic cup off the mattress. His face flushed dark red with anger. He turned sharply to the night nurse standing by the door. "Restrain her," Thorne snapped. "She is non-compliant, delusional, and hostile. Prep an intramuscular sedative immediately. I am going to my office to draft the indefinite commitment order. She is not leaving this ward." He stormed out of the room, his expensive leather shoes echoing aggressively down the hall. I remained perfectly still on the mattress, keeping my hands resting visibly on my knees. I shifted my gaze to the night nurse. He stepped further into the room and let the heavy door swing shut behind him. His name tag read David. He looked at the doorway where the corrupt doctor had just disappeared, then looked back down at me. He did not pull out any leather restraints. He did not reach into his pocket for a syringe. "I have worked in this psychiatric ward for 6 years," David said, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "I know exactly what a psychotic break looks like. You do not have an elevated heart rate. You are not sweating. Your speech is perfectly organized and your pupils are completely normal." He took a step closer, glancing nervously at the small observation window in the door. "And Thorne has been taking private meetings with the Montgomery family for a month," he continued. "I saw Kendra Montgomery hand him a thick envelope in the parking garage last week. He makes me sick. He uses this ward as a dumping ground for wealthy families who want to silence their relatives." I watched him carefully, recognizing a potential ally in hostile territory. "I need to make one phone call," I said quietly. "Just one. I can blow this entire operation wide open, but I cannot do it from inside this cell." David reached deep into the pocket of his scrub pants. He pulled out a cheap prepaid burner phone. "They monitor and record all the ward landlines," he said, sliding the small black phone across the mattress toward me. "You have exactly 5 minutes before I am required to report back to the nurses' station. Make it count." I picked up the phone. I did not dial a local defense attorney. I did not dial my parents. I dialed a 10-digit secure number I had memorized years ago during my military service. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Yeah, this is Mitchell," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "I need a massive favor." There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. The man listening was a former Marine intelligence officer. He was the same man I had dragged out of that burning Humvee in Syria while taking enemy fire. He was now a senior special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, stationed right here in Chicago. "I am locked in a psychiatric hold on fabricated medical charges," I continued. "The Montgomery real estate family is trying to seize my assets to cover up a $12 million federal tax fraud and money laundering scheme. I have their master corporate ledgers secured on an encrypted drive on my person. I need you to pull my military service records, verify my Navy Cross, and get a tactical team ready to intercept a highly corrupt judge. Are you in?" I heard the sharp sound of a chair scraping aggressively against a floor on the other end of the line. "Give me the address of the ward, Abby," the federal agent said, his voice turning deadly cold. "We are going hunting." The fluorescent lights in the psychiatric ward buzzed with a relentless low hum. I had been locked in that pale green room for exactly 68 hours. I spent the time executing mental exercises I had learned during my military survival training, keeping my mind razor sharp while the corrupt medical staff waited for me to break. They expected me to pace the floor. They expected me to scream at the reinforced door. They expected me to beg for a phone call to my parents. I did none of those things. I sat perfectly still on the bolted mattress and waited for the trap to spring. At 9 o'clock on the morning of the third day, the heavy metal door finally swung open. A man clutching a battered leather briefcase walked into the room. He wore a rumpled gray suit and looked thoroughly exhausted, carrying the distinct posture of a man who had spent his entire career pushing paper for people far more powerful than himself. The orderly closed the door behind him, leaving us alone in the sterile space. Abigail Mitchell, he said, not bothering to offer his hand. I am your court-appointed attorney. You can call me Mr. Wallace. We do not have much time, so I am going to be brutally honest with you. Your situation is catastrophic. I remained seated, my posture perfectly straight. Define catastrophic, Mr. Wallace. He pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and dropped them onto the end of my mattress. Your sister-in-law has formally filed the petition for a permanent conservatorship. She has sworn affidavits from your brother and your parents, stating you are a violent threat to society. She has a medical evaluation from Dr. Thorne recommending long-term institutionalization. And to make matters worse, she is pressing felony aggravated assault charges for the incident with the broken glass at the penthouse. I did not attack her, I stated calmly. She deliberately cut her own arm with a shard of glass from the door she destroyed. Wallace sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. It does not matter what actually happened. It only matters what they can prove. And in Chicago, the Montgomery family can prove whatever they want. They have the police report, they have the medical records, and most importantly, they have the judge. He tapped the top page of the file. Your emergency hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The case has been assigned to Judge Thomas Arrington. I am going to save you the trouble of hoping for a fair trial. Judge Arrington has been deeply tied to the Montgomery Real Estate Group for 2 decades. They fund his re-election campaigns. He attends their charity galas. He has never, not once in his entire career on the bench, ruled against their family interests. If you walk into his courtroom tomorrow fighting this, he will rubber stamp Thorne's medical evaluation and send you to a state psychiatric facility indefinitely. You will never see the outside of a locked ward again. I looked at the documents, then up at Wallace. You are my defense attorney. You are supposed to advocate for my freedom. Instead, you are standing in my cell delivering a thinly veiled threat from the prosecution. What is the real reason you came here today? Wallace shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the small observation window in the door. He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a separate, much thinner document. He slid it across the mattress toward me. I am here to offer you a lifeline, he said, lowering his voice. Kendra Montgomery is willing to make a deal. Sign this consent decree. It voluntarily surrenders administrative control of your $4 million trust to your brother Derek. In exchange, Kendra will drop the felony assault charges immediately. Dr. Thorne will sign a release stating you have stabilized and are fit to return to society. You walk out of here today a free woman. You lose the money, but you keep your freedom. It is your only way out of a straitjacket. I picked up the document. To an ordinary person, terrified by the prospect of being locked in an asylum forever, it would look like salvation. They would sign it blindly, just to breathe fresh air again. But I was not an ordinary person. I was a forensic financial investigator. I spent my days dissecting complex corporate contracts, hunting for buried clauses and hidden liabilities. I did not read the summary on the first page. I flipped straight to the dense, legally convoluted fine print at the back of the agreement. My eyes scanned the paragraphs, cutting through the heavy legal jargon with practiced precision. I stopped at Section 4, Paragraph B. I read the clause twice just to be absolutely certain. A cold, hard realization settled over me. Kendra was far more ruthless than I had originally calculated. This is not just a transfer of assets, I said, keeping my tone deadly flat. I looked up at Wallace. He immediately broke eye contact. It is a standard conservatorship agreement, Wallace stammered hastily. It just gives Derek administrative control over your accounts. You are lying, I replied, my voice slicing through the quiet room. This specific clause right here does not just hand over my $4 million. It explicitly states that by entering into this financial union, my trust absorbs the pre-existing liabilities of the conservator. Wallace took a step back, his face turning pale. I stood up from the mattress, holding the document tightly in my hand. They do not just want to steal my inheritance, I continued, stepping toward him. They owe the IRS $12 million in back taxes and fraud penalties. If I sign this piece of paper, I am not just giving them my money to pay their debts. I am legally assuming responsibility for their financial crimes. When the federal government finally audits the Montgomery Empire and the whole Ponzi scheme collapses, Derek and Kendra walk away clean because I signed a document taking the fall. They are trying to set me up for federal tax evasion. Wallace held his hands up defensively. I do not know anything about their taxes. I was just told to bring you the paperwork. I strongly advise you to sign it. You cannot beat them in Arrington's courtroom. I looked at the cowardly lawyer, then down at the predatory contract designed to destroy my entire life. Without a single moment of hesitation, I gripped the thick stack of paper with both hands and ripped the contract entirely in half. I dropped the torn pieces onto the floor right at his feet. You are fired, Mr. Wallace, I stated with absolute unwavering authority. He stared at the shredded documents, his jaw hanging open in shock. You are making a massive mistake. You have no legal representation. You are going to be walking into a rigged courtroom against a corrupt judge and a billionaire family with limitless resources. They will bury you. I smiled, a cold, dangerous smile that I had previously reserved for hostiles in combat zones. Go back to the Montgomery family and tell Kendra exactly what I said. I will not sign away my money. I will not sign away my freedom, and I will certainly not take the fall for her federal crimes. Tell her I will see her in court tomorrow morning, and tell her I am representing myself. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B swung shut behind me, sealing me inside the very arena they thought would be my slaughterhouse. Less than 24 hours after I shredded their predatory contract in the psychiatric ward, I walked down the center aisle wearing my crisp navy blue suit, the bronze Navy cross pinned firmly to my lapel. I did not have a briefcase full of legal tricks. I did not have a high-priced defense team. I had myself, and I had the truth. I took my seat at the defense table alone. Across the aisle, Kendra and Derek sat flanked by two attorneys in custom Italian suits. Kendra wore a modest pearl-colored dress clearly chosen to make her look soft, maternal, and innocent. Derek stared at the blank notepad in front of him, his shoulders hunched, still too much of a coward to look his little sister in the eye. Judge Thomas Arrington entered the room from his chambers. The bailiff called the court to order, and Arrington took his seat at the elevated bench. He glanced at my empty table, then down at his docket, a sneer immediately forming on his face. He noted for the record that I had fired my court-appointed counsel and was proceeding pro se representing myself. He warned me that the court would not offer me any leniency for my lack of legal training. I simply stood, clasped my hands behind my back, and told him I understood perfectly. Kendra's lead attorney wasted no time. He called his first and primary witness to the stand, Kendra Montgomery Mitchell. Kendra walked up to the witness box with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent her entire life manipulating public perception. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the whole truth, and sat down. Within 60 seconds, the performance began. Her attorney asked her to describe the events of Thanksgiving dinner. Kendra immediately brought a trembling hand to her mouth. She produced a pristine white tissue and dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes. She told the court how terrified she was, how I had suddenly snapped during a peaceful family meal, and how I had locked myself in Derek's office. She recounted the fabricated story of the broken glass, claiming I had charged at her with a jagged weapon. I sat at the defense table, a legal pad in front of me, taking meticulous notes. I did not object. I did not interrupt. Her attorney paced in front of the jury box, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. Mrs. Montgomery Mitchell, can you describe your sister-in-law's mental state since she returned from her military service? Kendra sniffled, looking at the judge with wide, sorrowful eyes. It has been a nightmare, Your Honor. We have tried everything to help her, but Abigail suffers from severe violent combat trauma. She refuses treatment. She wanders the city muttering to herself. We only filed for this conservatorship because we are desperately afraid she will squander the $4 million trust our grandfather left her. We just want to protect her finances so she can afford the psychiatric care she so clearly needs. It was a masterful lie delivered with terrifying conviction. But then she got greedy. Kendra looked over at me, her eyes zeroing in on the bronze medal pinned to my chest. The fake tears stopped for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of pure venomous spite. She thinks she is a hero. Your Honor. Kendra continued, her voice hardening just a fraction. But she is just a broken woman who plays dress-up with fake medals. She washed out of the Navy, she could not handle the pressure, and now she walks around wearing that unearned medal to demand respect she never worked for. It is tragic, really. We just want to get her into a secure facility before her delusions hurt someone else. Judge Arrington looked down at me, shaking his head in mock pity. Miss Mitchell, he said, his voice dripping with condescension, you have the right to object to the witness's characterizations. I stood up slowly, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. I have no objections at this time, Your Honor. Please let the witness continue. Arrington raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that I was not taking the bait. He gestured for the attorney to proceed. For the next 30 minutes, I sat in absolute silence while Kendra built a massive sprawling tower of perjury on the public record. She lied about my finances. She lied about my military discharge. She lied about her own family's immense, untouchable wealth, claiming they were stepping in purely out of the goodness of their billionaire hearts. Every word she spoke was being transcribed by the court stenographer. Every lie was being permanently etched into federal and state records. As a forensic accountant, I knew that perjury was only a crime if you could definitively prove the witness knew they were lying under oath. I needed her fully committed to her narrative. I needed her so deep in her own web of deception that she could never climb out. Finally, her attorney smiled and returned to his seat. Thank you, Mrs. Montgomery Mitchell. Your bravery in coming forward to help your sick relative is commendable. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Arrington looked at me, a bored expression on his face. Miss Mitchell, as you are representing yourself, you now have the right to cross-examine the witness. I strongly suggest you keep your questions brief and relevant. I picked up my legal pad and walked out from behind the defense table. I did not look angry. I did not look broken. I looked exactly like what I was, a highly trained investigator who had just cornered her target. I stopped a few feet away from the witness box, looking directly into Kendra's eyes. The smug confidence on her face began to waver just slightly as she realized I was not crying or shaking. Mrs. Montgomery Mitchell. I began, my voice echoing clearly off the wood-paneled walls. You just testified under oath that your family possesses immense generational wealth and that you are petitioning for this conservatorship solely to protect my $4 million from being squandered. Is that correct? Kendra lifted her chin, recovering her arrogant posture. Yes, that is correct. We have a moral obligation to manage your money responsibly. I took a single step closer to the witness stand. You claim you want to protect my finances. So tell the court, what is the exact balance of your family's offshore account in the Cayman Islands? Objection. The opposing counsel practically vaults over the plaintiff table, his face flushed with sudden panic. Irrelevant, Your Honor. The financial status of the Montgomery family has absolutely no bearing on the respondent's psychiatric evaluation. Judge Arrington does not even wait for me to defend the question. Sustained. He slams his heavy wooden gavel down with unnecessary force. Miss Mitchell, I warned you about going on fishing expeditions in my courtroom. You will confine your questions to the matter of your own mental competency, or I will end this cross-examination right now. Kendra exhales a sharp breath, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. She shoots a quick, grateful look up at the bench. The judicial system is protecting her exactly as she paid it to do. She adjusts her pearl-colored dress and settles back into her chair, her smug confidence instantly returning. I nod slowly, keeping my face entirely devoid of frustration. My military training taught me never to show the enemy when a strike misses its target. Understood, Your Honor. I reply, my voice perfectly level. I have no further questions for this witness. Kendra stands up quickly, eager to escape the spotlight before I can pivot to another angle. She walks back to her seat beside her high-priced attorneys, looking thoroughly pleased with her performance. She thinks she has successfully walled off her family's financial secrets. She is wrong. I turn back to the center of the room. The defense calls Derek Mitchell to the stand. Derek flinches as if struck physically. He looks at Kendra, who gives him a sharp nod of encouragement, silently ordering him to play his part in their scheme. He stands up, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, a suit undoubtedly purchased with his wife's family money. He wears an expensive gold watch that catches the courtroom lights, a visual prop meant to project success and stability. He walks to the witness box, places his hand on the Bible, swears to tell the truth, and sits down. I approach the wooden podium. Hello, Derek. Let us talk about financial responsibility. In your sworn affidavit, you state that you are stepping forward to act as my conservator because I am reckless, unstable, and incapable of managing my own assets. Is that an accurate summary of your position? Derek leans into the microphone. He puffs out his chest, attempting to project the image of a protective, responsible older brother. Yes, it is. Since you came back from your deployment, you have been totally unpredictable. You do not understand how the real world works anymore. Grandfather made a huge mistake leaving that money to you. You do not have the business acumen to handle a $4 million trust. You will blow through it in a year on crazy schemes. We are just trying to protect your future. I take a step closer to the witness box. So, to be clear, you believe you possess superior financial acumen. You believe you are the responsible sibling capable of managing vast sums of money. Absolutely, Derek replies, his confidence growing now that he is sticking to the script Kendra wrote for him. I am an executive vice president at Montgomery Real Estate Group. I handle multi-million-dollar portfolios every single day. I know how to protect assets. I know how to build wealth. You do not. I pick up a single sheet of paper from my legal pad. I hold it up so the overhead fluorescent lights catch the stark black ink. That is fascinating, Derek. I say, my voice dropping to a surgical, deadly calm. Because as a forensic financial investigator, I spend my days tracking where money actually goes rather than where people claim it goes. I follow the digital footprints that people try to hide, so I have a very simple mathematical question for you. The courtroom grows incredibly quiet. Even Judge Arrington leans forward slightly, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The bored, dismissive look on his face vanishes. Derek, if I am so financially irresponsible, and if you are such a master of asset protection, why did you text me exactly 60 days ago, begging for $200,000 to pay off an illegal sports betting syndicate in Atlantic City? Objection. Kendra's lawyer screams, jumping to his feet so fast his chair crashes backward into the wooden railing. This is outrageous hearsay and character assassination. It is not hearsay, Your Honor, I counter smoothly, turning to the judge and raising the piece of paper higher. I have the printed time-stamped text message logs right here, subpoenaed directly from my telecom provider and submitted into the discovery file. The petitioner opened the door to questions regarding financial competency when he claimed under oath that he was uniquely qualified to manage my inheritance. I am simply establishing his actual financial track record to prove he is unfit to serve as a conservator. Judge Arrington opens his mouth to sustain the objection, but before he can bring his gavel down, a sharp, ragged gasp echoes from the plaintiff table. Everyone turns to look. Kendra is staring at her husband, her eyes wide with absolute, unfiltered horror. Her perfect composure shatters into a million pieces. The color drains completely from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. Derek freezes in the witness box. His mouth opens, but no sound comes out. He looks away from me and stares directly at his wife. Absolute panic takes over his features. Sweat begins to bead on his forehead, rolling down his temples and soaking into the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He had never told her. The wealthy, powerful Montgomery family had absolutely no idea that the man they installed as an executive in their company was drowning in illegal gambling debt. Kendra realizes in real time that while she was busy trying to steal my money to save her family from a massive federal tax fraud investigation, her own husband was secretly bleeding them dry from the inside. The perfect marriage she projected to Chicago high society was entirely built on deceit. Derek grips the edges of the witness stand, his knuckles turning stark white. He ignores the judge, ignores his lawyer, and ignores the fact that he is sitting in a court of law. Kendra, he stammers into the microphone, his voice cracking with pure terror. Kendra, I can explain. Order in this court. Judge Arrington's voice thundered through the room, accompanied by the deafening crack of his wooden gavel. He struck the sounding block so hard, a dull echo vibrated in the floorboards. The absolute chaos that had just erupted at the plaintiff table was instantly silenced. Derek practically scrambled out of the witness box, his face slick with sweat. He did not look at me. He kept his head down, rushing back to his seat beside a now hyperventilating Kendra. The picture-perfect facade of the Montgomery dynasty was cracking wide open, exposing the rotting, desperate core underneath. Kendra glared at her husband with an expression of pure, unfiltered hatred. Her lead attorney, realizing their entire case was suddenly hemorrhaging credibility, scrambled to regain control of the narrative. He shot to his feet, straightening his custom Italian suit. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Dr. Eris Thorne to the stand. The heavy courtroom doors swung open and Dr. Thorne walked down the center aisle. He moved with the effortless arrogance of a man who believed his medical license made him a god. He wore a sharp charcoal suit beneath a pristine white lab coat, projecting an image of absolute authority. He stepped into the witness box, swore to tell the truth, and offered the judge a respectful practice nod. Kendra's attorney approached the podium, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. Dr. Thorne, you are a licensed psychiatric specialist in the state of Illinois. Can you please describe to the court the medical evaluation you conducted on Abigail Mitchell on the night of Thanksgiving? Thorne leaned into the microphone. He looked over at me with the same condescending, predatory smile he had worn in my isolation cell. I conducted a comprehensive psychiatric hold evaluation, Thorne stated smoothly. Miss Mitchell is suffering from severe schizoaffective disorder, heavily compounded by combat-induced psychosis. She exhibits intense paranoia, delusions of persecution, and a frightening detachment from reality. During my assessment, she was highly agitated and prone to violent outbursts. In my professional medical opinion, she is incapable of managing her own daily affairs, let alone a $4 million financial trust. She requires immediate permanent institutionalization in a secure psychiatric facility for her own safety and the safety of the public. The courtroom murmured. Kendra dabbed her eyes with a tissue, playing the heartbroken sister-in-law once again. The attorney thanked the doctor and returned to his seat, looking thoroughly satisfied. He had just handed the judge the exact medical justification needed to lock me away forever. Judge Arrington looked down at me, a cruel glint in his eye. Miss Mitchell, you may cross-examine the witness. I stood up from the defense table, picking up my legal pad. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of the erratic behavior Thorne had just described under oath. I walked toward the witness box with the calculated, methodical precision of a military tactician stepping onto a battlefield. Dr. Thorne, I began, keeping my gaze locked entirely on his face. You just testified that you conducted a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation on me. You claim I was highly agitated, violent, and experiencing a severe psychotic break. Is that correct? Yes, Thorne replied smugly. You were entirely unhinged. It was a textbook psychological collapse. I took a step closer. As a Navy corpsman, I spent years treating trauma patients in active war zones. I am intimately familiar with the physiological markers of a psychotic break. So, tell me, Dr. Thorne, during this comprehensive evaluation, what was my resting heart rate? Thorne frowned, clearly annoyed by the technical question. I do not have your exact chart in front of me, but your vitals were elevated. Your heart was racing. It was not, I countered flatly. My resting heart rate was exactly 60 beats per minute. I was sitting perfectly still on a bolted mattress. But let us move on to your treatment plan. You testified that I was so violently unstable that I required immediate chemical restraint. What specific medication did you prescribe to manage this severe psychosis? Thorne puffed out his chest, leaning back in his chair. He thought he had me boxed in. He thought his medical authority was unquestionable. I prescribed a heavy, fast-acting regimen of Chlorazil XR, specifically the 400 milligram dosage. It is a powerful antipsychotic used to rapidly suppress violent schizophrenic episodes. It was the only way to chemically restrain your dangerous tendencies. I looked down at my legal pad, then back up at him. I let a cold, devastating smile spread across my face. Chlorazil X. R 400 milligrams. You are absolutely certain that is the exact medication you prescribed to me in your psychiatric ward just 3 days ago. I am the chief of psychiatry. Thorne snapped, gripping the edges of the witness stand. I know exactly what I prescribed. That is absolutely fascinating, Dr. Thorne, I said, my voice ringing clearly through the silent courtroom. Because as someone who actually administered trauma medicine, I make it a point to stay updated on federal pharmaceutical guidelines. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded document printed directly from the federal database. I held it up for the entire room to see. The Food and Drug Administration pulled Chlorazil XR from the United States market exactly 3 years ago due to fatal cardiac side effects. It is federally illegal to prescribe, dispense, or manufacture that specific drug anywhere in this country. So how exactly did you administer an illegal discontinued medication to me 3 days ago? The color instantly drained from Thorne's face. His mouth opened, but he could not form a single word. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. You did not evaluate me, I continued, my voice striking him like a hammer. You never checked my vitals. You never administered a psychological assessment. You simply copy-pasted a fake diagnosis from a 5-year-old medical template because you were too lazy to update your own fraudulent paperwork. You took a bribe from Kendra Montgomery in a parking garage to lock a sane woman in a psychiatric cell so she could steal my inheritance. Objection! Kendra's attorney screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He waved his arms wildly. This is badgering the witness. This is a baseless, slanderous accusation. Thorne was sweating profusely, stuttering into the microphone. It was a clerical error. I misspoke. I meant a different medication. I am a respected doctor. He was crumbling. The perjury was glaring, undeniable, and entirely exposed on the public record. Any legitimate judge would have immediately stricken the medical evaluation from the record and ordered an investigation into the doctor. But Judge Arrington was not a legitimate judge. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with deafening force. That is enough, Miss Mitchell. Arrington roared, his face turning a furious shade of purple. He pointed his gavel directly at me. I will not sit here and allow you to harass a respected medical professional in my courtroom. You are twisting a simple verbal mistake to feed your paranoid delusions. I stared at the judge in disbelief. He had just perjured himself. I stated firmly. He admitted to prescribing a discontinued drug. I said that is enough. Arrington bellowed over me. I find Dr. Thorne's testimony entirely credible. Your ridiculous cross-examination only proves his point. You are hostile, combative, and completely detached from reality. A cold chill swept through my veins. The exposure was absolute. The medical fraud was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. And yet the judge was actively covering it up in broad daylight. The system was not just flawed, it was completely aggressively rigged. Arrington was determined to hand my life over to Kendra no matter how many laws he had to break to do it. Dr. Thorne practically sprinted out of the witness box the second Judge Arrington validated his perjured testimony. The corrupt psychiatrist scurried down the center aisle, wiping a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead, desperate to escape the courtroom before I could expose any more of his fraudulent medical practices. The system was protecting him, wrapping a thick layer of judicial immunity around his lies. Kendra smiled from the plaintiff table, her confidence fully restored. She leaned over and whispered something to her attorney. The lawyer nodded, stood up, and straightened his expensive silk tie. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Richard and Patricia Mitchell to the stand. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. My own parents walked down the aisle. They moved together, tightly linking arms, projecting the absolute picture of a heartbroken, exhausted older couple bearing the heavy burden of a sick child. My mother, Patricia, wore a conservative beige dress and carried a crumpled tissue in her hand. My father, Richard, kept his head bowed, playing the role of the tragic patriarch. They did not look at me. They looked directly at Kendra, offering her a subtle, subservient nod. They had entirely sold their souls to the Montgomery real estate empire. Kendra had bought their loyalty with first-class tickets to Europe, lavish holiday parties, and the intoxicating proximity to Chicago high society. To keep their VIP status in Kendra's world, they were fully prepared to throw their own daughter into a psychiatric ward. They stepped into the witness box together, placed their hands on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Kendra's attorney approached the podium with a gentle, sympathetic posture. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I know this is incredibly painful for you. Can you please describe your daughter's behavior leading up to this petition for a conservatorship? Patricia brought the tissue to her eyes, letting out a perfectly timed, trembling sigh. It has been a nightmare. Abby was always a difficult child. We gave her absolutely everything. We provided a beautiful home, a perfect upbringing, and endless love. But she was always so ungrateful, so reckless. When she came back from her military deployment, she became completely unrecognizable. She is hostile, she is paranoid. Patricia looked up at the judge, letting a single tear roll down her cheek. We are terrified of her. Your Honor, Kendra and Derek are saints for stepping in to handle her $4 million trust. We simply do not have the resources to manage a psychiatric crisis of this magnitude, but the Montgomery family does. We fully support transferring all of Abby's assets to Derek. It is the only way to save her. Richard nodded firmly beside her. We gave her the world and she threw it back in our faces. We just want our little girl to be safely locked away where she can get the help she refuses to accept. The courtroom fell dead silent, thick with the manufactured tragedy of their testimony. Kendra wiped a fake tear from her own eye. It was a flawless performance. They had painted me as an ungrateful, violent monster and elevated Kendra to a wealthy savior. The attorney thanked them and returned to his seat. Judge Arrington looked down at me, his face twisted in absolute disgust. Miss Mitchell, your own parents have just testified to your severe instability. Do you have any questions for these witnesses, or are you ready to stop wasting the court's time? I stood up from the defense table. I did not carry a tissue. I did not fake a single tear. I picked up a thin blue folder from my legal pad and walked straight toward the witness box. I stopped just a few feet away from the people who had brought me into this world. You just testified under oath that you gave me absolutely everything I said, keeping my voice as cold and hard as steel. You claimed you provided a perfect upbringing and that my hostility is simply the result of combat trauma. Is that your sworn statement, Patricia? My mother lifted her chin defensively. Yes. We gave you the world. You were just too stubborn to appreciate it. I opened the blue folder. I pulled out a stack of certified banking documents and held them up. As a forensic accountant, I track money for a living. I do not just track corporate fraud, I track personal financial histories. So I dug into the archives of the Central Illinois Bank. I pulled the exact routing numbers and transaction logs from 16 years ago. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes darted toward Kendra's attorney. Let us look at exactly what you gave me. I continued, my voice echoing loudly across the room. 16 years ago, I was a high school senior with a 4.0 grade point average. I had an educational trust fund set up by our grandfather specifically designated for my college tuition. It contained exactly $85,000. But according to these certified bank records on May 12th of that year, you and Richard drained that entire account to zero. My mother's face went completely pale. The tissue dropped from her hand. I took a step closer. Would you like to tell the court where my college tuition went, Patricia? Or should I read the dealership receipt attached to the back of this bank statement? You took my entire educational future and you used it to buy Derek a brand new Porsche 911 because he drunkenly wrapped his previous sports car around a telephone pole and you wanted to keep him out of jail. The courtroom erupted into a low, shocked murmur. Derek sank lower into his chair at the plaintiff table, his face turning bright red as the reporters in the gallery began furiously typing on their phones. You gave me nothing, I fired back, my voice vibrating with absolute authority. You stole my future to protect your golden boy. That betrayal is the exact reason I walked into a recruiting office and enlisted in the United States Navy at 18 years old. I went to a war zone to earn the GI Bill because my own parents robbed me blind. Do not sit in a court of law and blame my independence on combat trauma when my hostility comes entirely from your financial abuse. Objection! Kendra's lawyer screamed, jumping to his feet and slamming his hand on the table. Your Honor, the respondent is hostile. She is badgering the witnesses. She is displaying the exact aggressive, unhinged behavior outlined in the psychiatric report. I demand she be held in contempt of court immediately. My father pointed a trembling finger at me from the witness box. See what we have to deal with. She is a monster. She is out of control. Judge Arrington did not hesitate. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down repeatedly, echoing like gunshots through the room. The trap had closed perfectly. He used my aggressive cross-examination as the ultimate proof of my supposed insanity. Order. Order in my courtroom. Arrington roared, his face turning a furious, violent shade of purple. He glared down at me, his eyes filled with pure malice. Miss Mitchell, your despicable outburst against your own parents proves everything the petitioner has claimed. You are volatile. You are dangerous. You are completely unfit to manage your own life, let alone a $4 million estate. I have heard enough. I do not need to see any more evidence. He grabbed his pen and pulled the conservatorship decree toward him. Bailiff, step forward, Arrington commanded. The two armed guards at the back of the room immediately marched down the aisle, standing directly behind me. I will not allow a violent, delusional woman to turn this courtroom into a circus, the judge snarled, pointing his gavel directly at my chest, leading right up to the exact moment the trial had begun. Miss Mitchell, remove that fake piece of metal from your lapel. I am ruling in favor of the conservatorship. I will gladly comply with your order, Your Honor, I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I reached up to my lapel and unpinned the bronze medal. I placed the Navy Cross gently onto the defense table. Then, with a deliberate and calculated motion, I let the sleek, encrypted black USB drive slide from my palm. It hit the polished mahogany right next to the metal with a sharp, heavy clink that echoed perfectly in the sudden silence of the courtroom. Judge Arrington glared down at the small black device, his thick eyebrows furrowing in irritation. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, raising his gavel again. I stood perfectly straight, squaring my shoulders to the bench. Pursuant to the Illinois Rules of Evidence, Your Honor, I am invoking my right to present exculpatory evidence prior to the final rendering of a judgment. I submitted a duplicate of this drive to the court clerk at exactly 8 o'clock this morning, properly logged and entered into the official discovery docket for this proceeding. I request that the clerk display file folder 1 on the courtroom monitors. Kendra's lead attorney realized exactly what was happening a fraction of a second before anyone else did. The smug confidence completely evaporated from his face, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. He knew that pro se defendants usually stumbled over procedural rules, but I had just executed a flawless legal maneuver that legally compelled the court to view my evidence on the public record. Objection! The attorney screamed, practically vaulting over the plaintiff table. He lunged toward the center of the room, waving his arms frantically. This is an ambush. The respondent is introducing unverified digital media. Your Honor, I demand this drive be confiscated immediately. He actually sprinted toward the clerk's desk, reaching out as if he was going to physically slam his hand down on the keyboard or throw his body in front of the primary monitor. But the court clerk, a veteran civil servant who clearly had zero interest in Kendra Montgomery's wealth or her attorney's tantrums, simply ignored him and pressed the enter key. It was too late. The system was already connected. The massive 70-inch high-definition monitors mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life. The audio system engaged with a sudden, deafening burst of static. It was not a scanned document. It was not a medical chart. It was raw, unedited, officially declassified tactical footage from a United States military combat helmet camera. The courtroom was instantly transported to a sun-baked, war-torn highway in northern Syria. The sound of heavy artillery fire and desperate shouting blasted through the court speakers, making several people in the gallery physically jump in their seats. On the screen, a massive armored transport vehicle was engulfed in thick black smoke and roaring flames. Then the camera captured me. I was 26 years old on that screen, my uniform covered in desert sand motor oil and a terrifying amount of blood. The footage showed me sprinting directly into the kill zone, completely ignoring the relentless crackle of enemy rifle fire, kicking up dirt all around my boots. I reached the burning wreckage, grabbed a massive, heavily armored Marine whose leg had been shredded by shrapnel, and physically dragged his 200-pound body backward through the dirt, toward a concrete barrier. The camera angle shifted wildly, capturing the absolute chaos of the ambush, but it never lost sight of me. I secured a tourniquet around his leg, grabbed my medical kit, and ran straight back into the fire. I pulled out a second bleeding Marine, then I went back for a third. The courtroom watched in absolute paralyzed horror as the video showed me reaching into the smoking vehicle one last time. A sharp, cracking sound echoed through the speakers, distinct from the surrounding gunfire. The footage showed the exact moment a sniper round tore through my left shoulder. The kinetic impact violently jerked my body backward, slamming me into the side of the burning transport. But I did not drop the wounded Marine I was holding. I dragged him the final 20 yards with one functioning arm, leaving a trail of my own blood in the sand behind me. The video abruptly faded to black. The deafening sounds of warfare were replaced by the suffocating silence of the Chicago courtroom. A new image materialized on the screens. It was a high-resolution scan of a highly classified Department of Defense document. The official seal of the United States Navy gleamed at the top of the page. Below it was the formal citation for extraordinary heroism, detailing every single action the courtroom had just witnessed. At the bottom of the page, in stark blue ink, was the undeniable authenticated signature of the Secretary of the Navy. The proof was absolute. It was bulletproof. My Navy Cross was 100% real. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The reporters sitting in the back row of the gallery had completely stopped typing on their laptops, their mouths hanging open in stunned disbelief. My parents, Richard and Patricia, sat frozen in the witness box. They stared at the giant monitor, their faces drained of all color. They had just spent the last 20 minutes testifying under oath that I was a hostile, ungrateful monster who fabricated a military career. They were suddenly forced to watch the undeniable, visceral reality of what their daughter had actually survived while they were busy buying luxury sports cars for my brother. Derek sat at the plaintiff table looking physically sick. He swallowed hard, staring at the table, realizing the sheer magnitude of the lie his wife had forced him to support. Judge Thomas Arrington sat at the elevated bench, completely paralyzed. His heavy wooden gavel was suspended in midair, his hand trembling slightly. He had just mocked a legitimate, highly decorated combat veteran on the public record. He had ordered me to strip an earned Medal of Valor from my chest in a room full of journalists. He knew instantly that his blatant disrespect was going to be the headline of every major news outlet in the state by evening. The entire stolen valor narrative had just been utterly and violently shattered. Kendra's expensive lawyers had built their entire case on painting me as a delusional fraud, and I had just demolished their foundation with a single keystroke. I reached down to the defense table. I picked up my bronze Navy Cross, holding the heavy metal tightly in my palm. I did not look at the judge. I did not look at my parents. I turned my back to the bench and focused my gaze entirely on my sister-in-law. Kendra was gripping the edge of the plaintiff table so hard her manicured nails were digging into the wood. The arrogant, untouchable smirk she had worn since the trial began was entirely gone. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, realizing the carefully orchestrated spectacle she had paid for was rapidly turning into a slaughterhouse. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her table. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor cut through the absolute silence of the room. "We have established my service record," I said, my voice cold, sharp, and projecting flawlessly across the courtroom. I looked directly into Kendra's terrified eyes. "Now let us look at your valor, Kendra." I kept my eyes locked on Kendra as I pressed a single button on the wireless presentation remote. The massive high-definition monitors mounted on the courtroom walls instantly shifted. The visceral, blood-soaked footage of the Syrian combat zone vanished. In its place, a sprawling, incredibly complex forensic accounting spreadsheet materialized on the screens. It was a staggering web of financial data. I had color-coded the digital presentation so even a jury with absolutely no financial background could understand the massive fraud playing out in front of them. Red lines cascaded across the screen connecting a maze of shell companies' offshore accounts and corporate ledgers. At the very top of the hierarchy was the Montgomery Real Estate Group and their highly publicized family charity foundation. The courtroom remained dead silent. The gallery, the reporters, the bailiffs, and the judge were all staring at the brightly colored spreadsheet, trying to comprehend the sheer volume of data I had just dropped onto the public record. Your Honor. I began pacing slowly across the open floor of the courtroom. As we have just established, my combat record is completely authentic. I did not wash out of the military. I am a highly decorated veteran. But more importantly for the context of this hearing, my current civilian career is also very real. I am a certified forensic financial investigator. I track corporate fraud for a living. I follow the money that wealthy people try to hide. I pointed the laser pointer at the top of the monitor. For the past week, my sister-in-law has paraded herself in front of this court, claiming her family possesses immense, untouchable generational wealth. She swore under oath that the Montgomery family wanted to manage my $4 million inheritance purely out of the goodness of their hearts to protect me from my own supposed insanity. I clicked the remote again. A new document superimposed itself over the spreadsheet. It was an official, highly confidential notice of federal audit from the Internal Revenue Service. But as my forensic audit clearly shows, the Montgomery family is not wealthy at all. They are entirely broke. They are drowning in catastrophic debt. For the past 6 years, Kendra and her parents have been running a high-end Ponzi scheme through their family charity foundation. They have been illegally commingling charitable donations to pay off underwater commercial mortgages, trying to keep their failing real estate empire afloat. Kendra gripped the edge of the plaintiff table. Her mouth opened, but she was paralyzed by the sheer shock of seeing her most guarded criminal secrets projected onto a 70-inch screen in a court of law. And the federal government finally caught them. I continued, my voice ringing with absolute authority. That document on the screen is a 30-day final notice from the IRS. The Montgomery family owes $12 million in back taxes, corporate fraud penalties, and unpaid capital gains. If they do not inject a massive amount of liquid cash into their accounts immediately, the federal government is going to freeze all their assets and hand down federal indictments. I turned back to Kendra, delivering the final devastating blow. You did not bring me to this courtroom to protect my mental health, Kendra. You bought a fake psychiatric evaluation from a corrupt doctor because you were absolutely desperate. You needed to legally declare me insane so you could seize my $4 million trust and use my inheritance to pay off your federal tax debt. You tried to lock me in an asylum just to save yourself from federal prison. The entire courtroom erupted. The reporters in the back row began furiously whispering to one another, their fingers flying across their keyboards. The magnitude of the scandal was unprecedented. One of the most powerful political families in Chicago had just been exposed as massive financial frauds in open court. Kendra finally snapped. The elegant, composed, wealthy socialite facade completely shattered. She jumped to her feet, her chair crashing backward onto the floor. She hacked us. Kendra screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing a trembling finger at me. Your Honor, you have to arrest her. She illegally hacked into our private corporate servers. This evidence is stolen. It is inadmissible. She is a criminal. I could not help it. I smiled. A cold, surgical smile that let her know she had just made the ultimate mistake. Thank you, Kendra, I said smoothly. Kendra stopped screaming, her chest heaving as she stared at me in confusion. I turned to the court stenographer. Please let the official record reflect that the petitioner just publicly confirmed the absolute authenticity of the financial documents displayed on the screen. She did not deny the tax fraud. She only objected to how I obtained the proof. Kendra realized her fatal error instantly. She had just confessed to running a Ponzi scheme on the public record. Her lead attorney buried his face in his hands, realizing his client had just torpedoed their entire defense and practically handed the federal government a signed confession. And for the record, I added, turning back to the judge, I did not hack anything. Hacking implies I bypassed a secure firewall. I did no such thing. I looked directly at my brother Derek, who was sweating profusely and sinking lower into his chair. My brother is an executive vice president at your company, Kendra, but he is also incredibly lazy. Last week, Derek took his company laptop to a local coffee shop. He connected to an unsecured public wireless network. He then logged into your master corporate accounting portal using a password he has had since high school and walked away to order a latte, leaving the administrative server wide open on a public network. I did not have to hack your empire. Your husband practically handed me the keys to the castle. I simply downloaded the public records of your shell companies that he left exposed to the entire city. Kendra slowly turned her head to look at Derek. The sheer, unadulterated venom in her eyes was terrifying. All the rage, all the panic, and all the impending reality of federal prison funneled directly toward the man sitting next to her. She had spent years treating Derek like a lapdog, manipulating him to secure my inheritance, only to realize his sheer incompetence had just destroyed her entire life. You absolute idiot, Kendra, hissed her voice, vibrating with pure rage. You left the master ledgers open on a public network. I married you to get access to your grandfather's money, and you just handed her the evidence to send me to prison. Derek threw his hands up defensively, cowering away from his wife. Kendra, I swear I did not know she was tracking me. You know I do not understand how the network security works. You are the one who told me to bring the laptop. You stupid, worthless coward, Kendra shrieked. She did not wait for his excuse. Kendra lunged across the plaintiff table. She grabbed Derek by the lapels of his expensive custom suit and physically threw him against the wooden railing. The perfect, untouchable power couple was completely deteriorating in front of a live audience. Derek yelled out in panic as Kendra started hitting him, screaming at the top of her lungs about his gambling debts, his laziness, and how he had just ruined her family name. The bailiffs rushed forward, shouting commands to separate them, but Kendra was relentless. The courtroom had descended into absolute chaos, a beautiful, catastrophic implosion of their own making, but I was not finished. The dominoes were falling perfectly, and I still had one final slide to show. The two armed bailiffs rushed the plaintiff table, struggling to pry Kendra off my brother. Her perfectly manicured hands were locked onto his collar, and she was screaming insults that echoed off the high ceiling. Derek was shielding his face, cowering against the wooden railing, while his wife physically dismantled him in front of Chicago high society. Judge Thomas Arrington watched the destruction of his biggest political donors right in front of his eyes. The realization that the Montgomery family was completely bankrupt must have hit him like a physical blow. If they were broke, his campaign contributions stopped immediately. But more importantly, if their internal financial records were currently being broadcast on public monitors, his own dark secrets were entirely vulnerable. Arrington raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a frantic, terrifying force. The sound cracked through the courtroom like gunfire. Order, I demand. Order in this court. Bailiffs, separate them immediately and restrain the respondent. He pointed his gavel directly at me. His face was drenched in sweat, his chest heaving under his black judicial robes. Miss Mitchell, you have turned this proceeding into a criminal circus. I am ordering those monitors turned off this instant. You are under arrest for federal cybercrimes, corporate espionage, and contempt of court. Bailiffs, take her into custody right now. The two guards finally managed to pull Kendra away from Derek. They left the couple panting and disheveled at the plaintiff table and turned their attention toward me. They unclipped their metal handcuffs from their belts, advancing down the center aisle with purposeful strides. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I kept my hand wrapped tightly around the presentation remote. I had spent years tracking hostile targets, and I knew exactly when an enemy was operating on pure blind panic. Arrington was not acting like a judge maintaining order. He was acting like a criminal trying to destroy the evidence. Wait, Your Honor, I said, projecting my voice so it carried over the commotion perfectly. You are about to make a monumental mistake. You definitely want to see the last slide before you put me in handcuffs. Shut it off! Arrington bellowed, his voice cracking with sheer terror. He looked wildly at the court clerk sitting below the bench. Turn off the primary system immediately. That is a direct judicial order. But the clerk was frozen in her chair, staring wide-eyed at the screen. The reporters in the gallery were all standing up, holding their phones high above their heads to capture every single second of the meltdown. The entire room could feel the tectonic plates of power shifting. I pressed the button on the remote. The massive color-coded spreadsheet vanished. In its place, a crisp, high-resolution image filled the 70-inch monitors. It was a digital wire transfer receipt. It was not a complicated legal document or a confusing tax return. It was simple, undeniable, and utterly devastating. I turned toward the bench, looking directly into the terrified eyes of the man who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward just an hour prior. Let us look at the final transaction from the Montgomery Family Charity Foundation, I said, my voice echoing in the sudden, breathless silence of the room. On October 12th, exactly 5 weeks ago, a shell company registered to Kendra transferred exactly $500,000. The money was routed through a holding company in Delaware before being deposited directly into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Kendra stopped breathing. She looked up at the screen, her eyes wide with shock. Even she realized the magnitude of the mistake they had made. She had used a compromised account to bribe a sitting judge. I took a slow step closer to the bench. The bailiffs had completely stopped moving. They stood frozen in the center aisle, their handcuffs dangling uselessly from their fingers. They looked back and forth between me and the judge, completely unwilling to arrest a whistleblower who was actively exposing judicial corruption. Now I continued, keeping my tone surgical and precise. Offshore accounts are specifically designed to be anonymous. They are built to hide dirty money from the federal government. But when you are investigating corporate fraud, you learn how to track the secondary verification layers. I pulled the registration documents for that specific Cayman Islands account. It is owned by a private blind trust, and the sole beneficiary of that trust is sitting right in front of me. I raised my hand and pointed directly at the bench. You received a $500,000 bribe. Your Honor, I stated with absolute clarity. The Montgomery family paid you $500,000 to fast-track this conservatorship. They paid you to ignore my pristine combat record. They paid you to validate a perjured psychiatric evaluation from a corrupt doctor. And they paid you to strip me of my constitutional rights so they could steal my inheritance to cover their tax fraud. The color drained completely from Thomas Arrington's face. His skin turned an ashen, sickly shade of gray. His mouth hung open, but the arrogant, booming voice that had dominated the courtroom all morning was completely gone. He was staring at the undeniable proof of his own federal crimes projected in massive letters across the wall. You tried to ruin my life for a paycheck, I said, letting the sheer weight of the evidence crush him into the leather of his chair. You ordered me to strip my earned military medal from my chest to protect your wealthy donors, but you left a digital paper trail a mile wide. The heavy wooden gavel slipped from Arrington's trembling fingers. It hit the edge of the elevated bench, bounced off the polished wood, and clattered loudly onto the floor below. The sound of the wood striking the tile was the only noise in the entire courtroom. I leaned forward, stepping right up to the microphone at the defense table. I stared into the eyes of a ruined man. Did you really think a forensic accountant would not follow the money? The silence hanging in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the heavy, erratic breathing of Judge Thomas Arrington. He stared at the massive monitors displaying his own offshore banking records, his eyes wide with a feral, trapped terror. The blood had entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray against the stark black collar of his judicial robe. For 20 years, he had operated as a king in this courtroom, bending the law to the will of Chicago's wealthiest elites. In a matter of seconds, I had stripped away his crown and exposed him as a common criminal. He tried to speak, but his jaw simply moved up and down without producing any sound. The two armed bailiffs standing in the center aisle looked at each other, completely paralyzed. They were trained to follow the orders of the bench, but they were now staring at undeniable proof that the man sitting on that bench had just accepted a $500,000 bribe. Neither guard made a single move to step toward me. The authority Arrington once wielded had evaporated the moment that wire transfer illuminated the room. Arrington finally found his voice. It was not the booming, arrogant roar he had used to threaten me with a psychiatric ward. It was a high, thin, desperate squeak. "This is a fabrication!" Arrington shrieked, slamming his palms flat against the top of the wooden desk. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting from the shocked reporters in the gallery to the court stenographer who was still typing every single word. "Turn those screens off. I am the presiding judge of this court, and I order this room cleared immediately." He did not wait for the bailiffs to react. Arrington abruptly pushed himself up from his heavy leather chair. He pushed back so violently that the chair tipped over, crashing loudly onto the floorboards behind the bench. He grabbed the edges of his black robes, his hands shaking uncontrollably, and turned toward the private door that led directly into his judicial chambers. He was not trying to restore order. He was trying to flee. He knew that the moment he stepped off the bench, the FBI would be tracking his digital footprint, and he desperately needed to reach his private computer to start wiping servers. "This hearing is in recess," Arrington yelled over his shoulder, stumbling over the fallen chair as he scrambled toward the heavy wooden door of his private exit. "I will not have my courtroom hijacked by a psychotic woman." He reached his hand out, his fingers wrapping around the brass doorknob of his chambers. He never got to turn it. The primary double doors at the back of the courtroom did not just open. They burst inward with a tremendous, deafening crash. The heavy oak panels slammed violently against the interior walls, shaking the entire room. "Nobody move. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them." A shockwave of absolute chaos swept through the gallery as a dozen men and women stormed down the center aisle. They moved with flawless, terrifying, tactical precision. They wore heavy, dark tactical gear, thick bulletproof vests, and navy blue windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their backs. The boots of the federal agents hit the polished hardwood floor in perfect unison, bringing a staggering, overwhelming force into the previously quiet room. The reporters in the back rows scrambled out of the way, pressing themselves against the wooden pews. Kendra's highly paid attorneys threw their hands up into the air, immediately stepping back from the plaintiff table and completely abandoning their clients to avoid interfering with a federal raid. Leading the tactical formation was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp, uncompromising eyes. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at the lawyers. He walked straight down the aisle with the distinct predatory stride of a former Marine. It was Special Agent Reynolds, the military intelligence officer I had dragged out of a burning convoy in Syria, the exact same man I had called from a smuggled burner phone inside a locked psychiatric ward just 3 days ago. Agent Reynolds bypassed the defense table completely. He marched straight up to the elevated bench flanked by 2 heavily armed federal agents. Arrington froze with his hand still gripping the brass doorknob of his chambers. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes bulging as he took in the sight of the federal tactical team swarming his courtroom. "You have no jurisdiction here," Arrington screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. "This is a state court. You cannot barge into my courtroom while I am presiding over a hearing. I demand you leave this room immediately." Agent Reynolds did not slow his pace. He walked right up the wooden steps leading to the bench, invading the judge's personal space without a single ounce of hesitation. He pulled a thick folded federal warrant from the inside pocket of his windbreaker and slapped it hard against the wood, right where Arrington's gavel had rested. "Thomas Arrington." Agent Reynolds stated, his deep voice carrying a cold, uncompromising authority that easily dominated the room. "You are under arrest for federal corruption, wire fraud conspiracy to commit medical fraud, and accepting illicit bribes to influence a judicial proceeding. This is an outrage." Arrington sputtered, physically backing away until his spine hit the door of his chambers. "You have no proof. That document on the screen is a digital forgery." Agent Reynolds did not entertain the argument. He simply nodded to the 2 agents standing beside him. We have the offshore routing numbers, we have the shell company registrations, and we have the communications you had with Dr. Thorne. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. The two federal agents stepped forward, grabbing the judge by his arms and spinning him around forcefully. Arrington let out a pathetic, whimpering gasp as they pushed him against the heavy oak door. The metallic, rhythmic clicking of steel handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom as they bound his wrists tightly together over his black judicial robes. The man who had spent decades destroying lives for profit was reduced to a trembling, hyperventilating criminal in a matter of seconds. I stood at the defense table watching the arrest unfold with absolute clarity. Agent Reynolds turned his head slightly and locked eyes with me. He did not smile, but he gave me a single firm nod. The tactical strike we had coordinated from a locked hospital cell had been executed perfectly. The corrupt judicial shield protecting the Montgomery family was completely neutralized. But the raid was not over. As the federal agents marched a sobbing, handcuffed Judge Arrington down from the bench, the focus of the room violently shifted. The heavy, rhythmic footsteps of tactical boots echoed on the floorboards as two more FBI agents broke away from the main formation. They did not head for the exit. They marched directly toward the plaintiff table. Kendra had been standing frozen in her pearl-colored dress, watching her bought and paid-for judge get dismantled in real time. The arrogant, untouchable smirk she had worn for the last 72 hours completely evaporated, replaced by a hollow, breathless terror. She realized instantly that the federal raid was not just about the man on the bench. It was about the $12 million tax fraud and the bribery scheme I had just broadcast to the entire world. The two federal agents stopped squarely in front of Kendra, boxing her in against the wooden railing. Kendra Montgomery Mitchell, one of the agents said, pulling a second federal warrant from his tactical vest. Kendra took a stumbling step backward, her perfectly manicured hands shaking violently as she stared at the federal agents closing in on her. The two federal agents stepped squarely into Kendra's path, their heavy tactical boots planting firmly on the polished hardwood floor. They completely blocked her access to the center aisle. Kendra pressed her back against the wooden railing of the plaintiff table. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled from her physical altercation with Derek moments earlier, but her arrogant, manipulative instincts flared up in a final, desperate attempt at survival. She lifted her chin, trying to summon the formidable, untouchable aura of a Chicago real estate heiress. She pointed a trembling finger at the agent holding the federal warrant. "You cannot do this!" Kendra shouted, her voice shrill and echoing off the high ceilings. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? Do you know who my father is? My family practically built this city. We fund the mayor. We fund the police union. You do not just barge into a courtroom and put your hands on a Montgomery." The federal agents did not blink. They did not take a step back. They simply stood there, an immovable wall of federal authority wearing thick Kevlar vests. Kendra realized her wealth and political threats were bouncing off them like harmless pebbles. She instantly pivoted to her final line of defense. She turned toward the gallery, looking directly at the journalists who were filming her every move on their cell phones. She widened her eyes, playing the ultimate victim for the cameras. "This is a targeted attack on a powerful Black family." Kendra screamed, her voice breaking with manufactured outrage. "You are witnessing a modern-day lynching of Black generational wealth. The federal government is targeting us because we are successful Black entrepreneurs. They are trying to tear down my father's legacy over a simple tax misunderstanding. Someone call the press. Call the civil rights attorneys. Get your hands off me." Special Agent Reynolds turned away from the handcuffed judge. He walked slowly down the steps from the bench and approached Kendra. He did not raise his voice. He did not look angry. He looked at her with the cold, absolute detachment of a predator watching its prey exhaust its final breath. "Your father was arrested 20 minutes ago at his country club," Mom Agent Reynolds stated. His deep voice easily overpowered her hysterical shouting. Kendra froze. The air completely left her lungs, her arms dropped to her sides. Agent Reynolds stepped closer, holding up his own copy of the federal indictment. "He was detained on the 18th hole, alongside your uncle and your chief financial officer. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation are currently executing simultaneous raid warrants on your corporate headquarters, your family estate, and your offshore holding companies. Your father is currently sitting in the back of a federal transport vehicle. And now, Mom, you are next. The color drained entirely from Kendra's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The realization crashed down on her with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. Her father, the untouchable titan of Chicago real estate, was in handcuffs. The billions of dollars, the political influence, the offshore accounts, the entire Montgomery empire was dead. It was all gone, and she was going to federal prison right alongside him. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, the federal agent standing in front of her commanded. Kendra did not fight. The fight had been completely hollowed out of her. Her knees buckled slightly as the agents grabbed her arms, spinning her around and pressing her against the edge of the plaintiff table. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists echoed through the room. The cold steel locked tightly over the sleeves of her expensive pearl-colored designer dress. I stood at the defense table watching the woman who had tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward get reduced to a trembling, handcuffed criminal. The arrogant socialite who had mocked my combat trauma was now weeping openly, her tears ruining her expensive makeup as the agents read her Miranda rights. But the federal sweep of the courtroom was not quite finished. At the very back of the gallery, a figure suddenly jumped up from the wooden pews. It was Dr. Eris Thorne. The corrupt psychiatrist had been sitting in the audience waiting to testify against me again if needed. When the FBI stormed the room and arrested the judge, Thorne had tried to sink down in his seat to avoid detection. But watching Kendra Montgomery get handcuffed was the final straw. He realized his name was on the fraudulent medical evaluations that tied him directly to their federal conspiracy. Thorne bolted. He shoved past a row of terrified reporters sprinting toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. He was frantic, his pristine white lab coat flapping wildly behind him as he tried to make a break for the hallway. He never even reached the door handle. One of the court bailiffs, a massive, broad-shouldered man who had just spent the last 20 minutes watching his corrupt boss get dismantled by the FBI, saw his opportunity to prove his loyalty to the law. The bailiff lunged across the aisle. He hit Dr. Thorne at a full sprint. The impact was brutal. The bailiff tackled the corrupt doctor perfectly around the waist, lifting his feet entirely off the floor. Thorne let out a high-pitched yelp as the bailiff slammed him face first into the solid oak doors. The doctor bounced off the heavy wood and crashed hard onto the floorboards. The bailiff dropped his full body weight onto Thorne's back, driving a knee sharply between his shoulder blades and twisting the doctor's arms violently behind his back. "Do not move a muscle, Doc," the bailiff roared, pulling his own set of handcuffs from his utility belt and ratcheting them tightly onto Thorne's wrists. The entire conspirator network was crumbling in real time. The judge was in federal custody, the wealthy mastermind was in handcuffs, the corrupt doctor was pinned to the floor by court security. The brilliant invincible syndicate that had conspired to steal my $4 million inheritance had been entirely eradicated in under 10 minutes. The courtroom was a chaotic sea of federal agents securing evidence, reporters shouting questions, and bailiffs clearing the gallery. But amidst the swirling destruction, one person remained completely untouched by law enforcement: Derek Mitchell. My older brother stood completely alone at the plaintiff table. The federal agents had stepped around him to arrest his wife. They had ignored him entirely. He was not a mastermind. He was not a threat. He was just a cowardly, incompetent pawn who had blindly followed his wife's orders. Derek looked around the ruined courtroom. He watched the agents march Kendra toward the exit. He watched the judge get dragged away. He realized in a matter of seconds that his entire life was over. The Montgomery wealth he relied on was seized by the federal government. His wife was going to prison. His luxury penthouse would be foreclosed on. And looming over all of it was the massive, violent, illegal gambling debt that he still owed to a ruthless sports betting syndicate. He had absolutely nothing and no one left in the world, except me. Derek turned slowly toward the defense table. His face was a portrait of pure, pathetic desperation. His eyes were red and filling with tears as he looked at the sister he had betrayed, the sister he had tried to lock in a psychiatric hospital just to save his own skin. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward me, reaching out his hand like a drowning man grasping for a life raft. "Abby, please!" Derek begged, his voice cracking into a miserable, high-pitched sob. "Tell them I had nothing to do with the money. Tell them Kendra forced me to sign those papers. You are my little sister. Please, you have to save me." I stood behind the defense table and watched my older brother unravel. Derek was breathing in short, erratic gasps, his eyes darting frantically around the ruined courtroom. Behind him, the federal agents were hauling his wife toward the heavy oak doors, her designer heels dragging awkwardly across the floorboards. The corrupt psychiatrist was pinned to the ground by court security. The powerful judge who had tried to end my life was gone. Derek was completely abandoned. The Montgomery family wealth he had clung to for 5 years had evaporated in the span of 15 minutes. He took another trembling step toward me. He reached out across the polished wood of the defense table, his hands shaking so violently his expensive gold watch rattled against his wrist. "Abby, please." Derek begged, his voice cracking into a miserable, high-pitched sob. "Tell them I had nothing to do with the money. Tell them Kendra forced me to sign those papers. You are my little sister. Please, you have to save me." I did not reach back. I simply looked at his trembling hands, then up at his tear-streaked face. "You want me to save you?" I stated, keeping my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You sat at that plaintiff table an hour ago and swore under oath that I was a violent, psychotic threat to society. You signed a medical directive authorizing a corrupt doctor to lock me in a windowless cell and pump me full of heavy sedatives. You did all of that, Derek. You did not look away when they put me in handcuffs." "I had no choice," Derek cried, gripping the edge of the table. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a desperate, frantic whisper. "You do not understand how ruthless her family is. Kendra manipulated me. She brainwashed me. Her father threatened to fire me from the real estate group if I did not go along with the conservatorship. They held my gambling debts over my head. I was trapped. I never wanted to hurt you, Abby. She is a monster. I was just trying to survive her." He was throwing his own wife under the bus without a single second of hesitation. He had zero loyalty to anyone but himself. I looked at the pathetic, cowardly man standing in front of me. I felt absolutely nothing for him. The brother I had grown up with died the moment he watched the police drag me out of his penthouse on Thanksgiving. "I am not going to save you, Derek," I said smoothly. "But you should read what your beloved wife was planning to do to you." I reached down and picked up the physical blue folder resting on my legal pad. I had brought hard copies of everything, knowing that technology could sometimes fail, but paper was permanent. I opened the folder, pulled out a thick stack of documents stapled tightly together at the corner, and tossed them across the table. They slid over the polished wood and stopped right in front of his shaking hands. Derek stared at the stack of paper as if it were a live explosive. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I did not just download the corporate ledgers when I accessed your laptop," I explained, keeping my tone surgical and precise. "I downloaded your wife's personal correspondence. You see, Derek, our grandfather, was a very smart man. He structured his trust fund with specific legal protections. Kendra had absolutely zero legal standing to petition for control of my money. She is not a blood relative. She needed you. She needed my next of kin to be officially appointed as the conservator so the funds could be legally transferred." Derek looked down at the document. The bold black letters at the top of the first page read, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." "That is a draft of your divorce papers," I stated clearly. Kendra hired one of the most aggressive, high-priced family law attorneys in Chicago exactly 3 weeks ago. She paid a $20,000 retainer fee from her personal account to have those documents drawn up and kept on standby. Derek began to read the fine print. His eyes widened in absolute horror as his brain processed the legal traps hidden in the text. I watched the realization crush him. "I will summarize it for you," I said. "Kendra was never going to pay off your illegal gambling debts. Section 4 of that divorce petition explicitly states that you are entirely and solely responsible for the $200,000 you owe to the Atlantic City sports betting syndicate." She cited your illegal gambling as grounds for complete asset forfeiture. She was not going to give you a single cent of alimony. Derek gasped for air, his hands clutching the divorce papers so tightly the pages began to tear. She was going to leave me, he choked out, staring blindly at his wife's signature on the draft. She was going to leave you the exact minute this trial ended, I corrected him. Once Judge Arrington signed the conservatorship order, you would have gained control of my $4 million. Kendra was going to have you transfer those funds into a joint Montgomery holding account to pay off her family's federal tax fraud. And the very next morning, she was going to file those exact divorce papers, lock you out of the penthouse, and leave you entirely broke, unemployed, and at the mercy of a violent gambling syndicate. The truth completely shattered him. Derek had sold his soul, betrayed his only sister, and committed multiple federal crimes, all to protect a marriage that did not actually exist. Kendra had viewed him as nothing more than a convenient disposable tool to bypass the legal restrictions of my trust fund. He was a pawn, and his usefulness had an expiration date that was rapidly approaching. She used me. Derek whispered, the documents slipping from his hands and scattering across the defense table. She set me up. Yes, I said coldly. She used you. Our parents used you. And you let them do it because you were too lazy and too cowardly to ever build a life of your own. Derek looked at me. The sheer, overwhelming devastation of his reality finally broke his legs. His knees buckled completely. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor right in the center aisle of the courtroom. He fell to his knees, dropping his head into his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The custom-tailored suit he wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume. He was a completely ruined man. He realized in that exact moment that he had thrown away the only person in the world who had ever genuinely cared about him. I had loved my brother once. I would have protected him if he had just asked for help. But he had chosen greed. I did not offer him a hand. I stepped around his sobbing figure, picking up my bronze Navy cross from the table and pinning it securely back onto the lapel of my suit. The courtroom was mostly empty now, cleared out by the federal agents securing the crime scene. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw two figures hovering near the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were standing together, trembling. They had watched their wealthy daughter-in-law get hauled away in handcuffs. They were watching their golden boy sob on the floor, and now they were looking directly at me. I turned my body completely, squaring my shoulders to face the two people who had brought me into this world. The massive courtroom was rapidly emptying. A handful of federal agents remained meticulously taping up boxes of evidence from the plaintiff table where Kendra and Derek had sat just an hour ago. The air in the room felt lighter, purged of the heavy, suffocating corruption that had dominated the morning. But the final piece of the rotting family dynamic still stood by the heavy oak doors. Richard and Patricia Mitchell took a hesitant step forward. They looked nothing like the arrogant, self-righteous witnesses who had taken the stand earlier. The smug confidence they had borrowed from Kendra's wealth was completely stripped away. They looked old, fragile, and utterly terrified. They had just watched a federal tactical team dismantle the billionaire empire they had banked their entire future on. They had watched their corrupt judge get dragged away in steel handcuffs. My mother, Patricia, was the first to speak. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her hands trembling violently as she clutched her expensive designer handbag. She stumbled down the center aisle, her beige dress wrinkling as she rushed toward me. She threw her arms open, letting out a loud theatrical sob that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "Oh, honey," Patricia cried, her voice cracking with manufactured anguish. She reached out desperately, trying to wrap her arms around my shoulders. "We did not know. I swear to you, Abby, we had absolutely no idea what she was planning. Kendra lied to us. She manipulated us, just like she manipulated your brother. I did not let her touch me." I took a sharp, immediate step backward. My eyes were locked onto hers, cold and entirely unyielding. "Do not put your hands on me," I stated, my voice echoing with a surgical precision that made her freeze instantly. Her arms dropped limply to her sides. "Abby, please, my father," Richard pleaded, stepping up right beside her. He wrung his hands together, his face a portrait of pathetic desperation. "You have to believe us. Kendra told us that your trust fund was going to be taxed heavily if we did not move it into her family's accounts. We thought we were protecting your future. We were just trying to help you. I stared at the two cowards standing in front of me. They were still lying. Even after watching the entire syndicate collapse, their first instinct was to spin a new narrative where they were innocent victims instead of willing accomplices. You are lying, I said smoothly. You knew exactly what she was doing. You sat in that witness box less than 2 hours ago and swore under penalty of perjury that I was a violent, psychotic monster. You looked a federal judge in the eye and demanded I be locked in a psychiatric asylum for the rest of my life. You did not do that because you were manipulated by Kendra. You did it because you are greedy. Patricia shook her head wildly, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks. No, that is not true. We love you. You are our daughter. You did not care about me, I fired back my voice, rising just enough to command absolute attention. And you certainly did not care about my mental health. You just did not care because Kendra bought your loyalty. You sold your own daughter to a psychiatric ward because Kendra bought you those first-class tickets to Europe last month. You perjured yourselves for a luxury vacation to Paris and a VIP membership to her father's country club. You traded my freedom for proximity to high society. Richard flushed a deep, ugly shade of red. He looked around the courtroom paranoid that the remaining federal agents might be listening to his confession. Abby, you have to understand our position. He stammered, his voice dropping to a harsh, defensive whisper. Since I retired, things have been incredibly tight financially. We have barely been able to maintain the mortgage on the house. Kendra promised us that if we helped secure the conservatorship, she would take care of us for the rest of our lives. You have $4 million. We were desperate. We just wanted to make sure our retirement was secure. He was trying to use guilt to bridge the gap. He was trying to appeal to a sense of familial obligation that he had personally destroyed 16 years ago when he stole my college fund. He actually thought that admitting his financial desperation would make me pity him. I looked at my father. I felt a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a forensic accountant who had just traced the final transaction in a massive fraud case. You wanted to make sure your retirement was secure, I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. Yes, Richard nodded eagerly, thinking he had finally found a lifeline. Exactly. We were just trying to protect our golden years. That is incredibly ironic, Richard, I said, shifting my gaze between my mother and my father. Because when I was locked inside Derek's office on Thanksgiving, pulling the master ledgers for the Montgomery Real Estate Group, I did not just find their massive federal tax debt. As a financial investigator, I track every single inbound and outbound transaction connected to a corrupt entity. I tracked all the private investments that were feeding their Ponzi scheme. Patricia stopped crying. The manufactured tears dried up instantly. Her eyes widened, a sudden primal fear creeping into her expression. What do you mean? She whispered. By the way, Mom, I continued, my tone dropping to a deadly quiet calm. You know the massive retirement fund you and Dad cashed out last year? The one you blindly invested directly into the Montgomery Real Estate Group because Kendra promised it would double your annual returns. Richard took a stumbling step backward. His jaw dropped open. I did not stop. I delivered the final devastating blow with absolute precision. The FBI just seized it, I stated clearly. The federal government froze every single asset connected to the Montgomery Shell Companies 30 minutes ago. Your retirement fund was tied directly to a federal tax fraud and money laundering investigation. It is completely gone. You are entirely bankrupt. The air was sucked completely out of the room. Patricia let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her hands flew to her chest, her fingers clawing at the fabric of her beige dress. The color vanished from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. She let out a high-pitched, piercing scream that echoed off the high ceiling of the courtroom. Her knees buckled instantly. She physically collapsed, fainting dead away and crashing hard onto the wooden floorboards. Richard did not even try to catch his wife. He dropped to his knees right next to her unconscious body, but he did not look at her. He looked straight up at me. His eyes were wild, completely consumed by the sheer terror of absolute financial ruin. "Abby, please!" Richard begged, crawling forward on his knees until he was inches from my boots. "You have $4 million. You have to give us a loan. We will lose the house. We will have absolutely nothing. You cannot just leave us like this. You are our daughter." I looked down at the pathetic, groveling man at my feet. "You stole my college fund to buy a sports car," I said, my voice like ice. "You committed federal perjury to lock me in an asylum. I am not a bank, and I am certainly not your daughter." I turned my back on him. I did not look at my unconscious mother. I did not look at my sobbing brother. I walked straight down the center aisle, my tactical boots echoing loudly against the polished wood. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped out into the bright, sunlit hallway, leaving the ruins of my former family behind me forever. The aroma of roasted espresso beans mixed with the crisp, cold air blowing in from the busy Chicago streets. I sat alone at a small marble table in the corner of a high-end coffee shop located right in the heart of the financial district. My posture was relaxed but alert, my hands wrapped comfortably around a warm cup of black coffee. It had been exactly 168 hours since I walked out of that courtroom and left the wreckage of my toxic family behind. I was wearing a sharply tailored slate gray suit blending in perfectly with the morning rush of executives and corporate lawyers pouring into the cafe. Above the espresso machines, a row of wide, flat-screen televisions broadcast the local morning news. Every single channel was dominated by the exact same headline flashing in bold red letters across the bottom of the screen: "The Montgomery-Arrington Corruption Scandal." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee and watched the absolute destruction of my sister-in-law play out in high definition. The news broadcast showed exclusive footage of Kendra Montgomery Mitchell. She was no longer wearing her custom-tailored pearl-colored dresses or flaunting her expensive designer handbags. She was wearing a standard-issue bright orange federal holding uniform. Her hands, the same hands that had purposely smashed a glass door and faked a bloody injury to frame me for assault, were now locked in heavy steel cuffs chained securely to her waist. She looked haggard, terrified, and completely stripped of the arrogant superiority she had wielded like a weapon her entire life. The news anchor announced that a federal judge had officially denied Kendra bail just an hour ago. The massive offshore accounts I had exposed during my cross-examination made her an extreme flight risk. Her father, the once untouchable titan of Chicago real estate, was sitting in a federal detention center right alongside her. The entire Montgomery empire was frozen dead in its tracks, bleeding millions of dollars a day, as the Internal Revenue Service systematically seized property after property to cover their massive tax fraud and money laundering schemes. The broadcast then cut to a photograph of Thomas Arrington, the arrogant, booming judge who had tried to strip me of my military honor. Was now a disgraced criminal facing up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. His judicial career was entirely obliterated. The news reported that every single case he had presided over involving the Montgomery family was currently being aggressively audited by the Department of Justice. He had traded his legacy for a bribe, and now he was going to spend his golden years behind bars. Next, the news segment shifted to Dr. Eris Thorne. The state medical board had held an emergency disciplinary hearing 3 days ago. They permanently revoked his medical license and handed his entire patient archive over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was facing his own severe federal indictments for medical malpractice, conspiracy, and wire fraud. The private psychiatric ward he used as a dumping ground for wealthy families to silence their unwanted relatives had been raided and permanently shut down by the health department. I set my coffee cup down on the marble table as my cell phone chimed with a priority notification from my bank. I opened the secure financial application and looked at the balance displayed in bold green numbers. $4 million. The legal transition had been completely finalized that morning. The federal court had officially granted me full, uncontested control of the inheritance my grandfather had left me. The illegal conservatorship petition had been thrown out with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, the federal judge overseeing the corruption sweep had ordered the 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold to be entirely expunged from my permanent record. Legally, It was as if the false medical evaluation had never existed. My physical freedom, my financial autonomy, and my unblemished military record were completely secure. I reached up and lightly touched the lapel of my tailored blazer. I was not wearing my Navy Cross today, but I did not need to. The entire city knew it was real. I had fought a brutal war on two different fronts, and I had decisively won both of them. I was just about to close my banking application and head out to view a newly leased office space when my phone vibrated violently against the marble table. An incoming call lit up the screen. The caller ID simply displayed an unknown local number. I let it ring. I had no interest in speaking to reporters looking for an exclusive interview or distant relatives coming out of the woodwork to ask for financial handouts now that my wealth was public knowledge. The call went to voicemail. 30 seconds later, an automated transcription of the audio message popped up on my screen. I pressed play and lifted the phone to my ear, listening to the audio recording. The voice on the other end was raspy, shaking uncontrollably, and completely stripped of any false bravado. It was Derek. The background noise sounded like heavy traffic and howling winter wind. He was standing outside somewhere on the freezing Chicago streets. "Abby, please pick up the phone," my older brother begged, his teeth audibly chattering through the speaker. "You have to help me. The federal agents locked me out. They seized the penthouse this morning and confiscated all my accounts. Kendra's lawyers completely abandoned me. I do not have a single dollar to my name. My credit cards are declining everywhere, and the sports betting syndicate sent 2 armed men to look for me at the Montgomery corporate office yesterday. I had to run. I have been sleeping in a bus terminal. I am freezing, Abby. They are going to kill me over that $200,000 debt. You are the only person left in the world who can save me. I know I messed up, but you have $4 million now. Please just call me back. I am begging you. Give me a loan." The automated voicemail transcription ended, leaving the digital text of my brother's pathetic, shivering pleas glowing brightly on my phone screen. I sat in the warmth of the high-end coffee shop, the rich aroma of roasted espresso surrounding me, and took a slow, deliberate sip from my cup. I listened to the actual audio one more time. I heard the wind howling through the Chicago bus terminal. I heard his teeth audibly chattering. I heard the sheer, unadulterated terror in his voice as he realized the violent sports betting syndicate was actively hunting him across the city. He was begging for a loan. He was begging to sleep on my couch. He wanted just a fraction of the $4 million he had tried to steal from me just a week ago. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the sudden urge to rescue him. As a forensic investigator, I analyzed data without emotion, and the data in his voicemail was incredibly revealing. Derek did not apologize for standing in my penthouse and watching the police slap handcuffs on me. He did not apologize for signing a fraudulent medical directive to have me locked in a windowless psychiatric cell. He did not apologize for committing federal perjury and testifying under oath that I was a violent, psychotic monster. He was only sorry that his wife got caught. He was only sorry that his meal ticket had been seized by the federal government. He was only reaching out to me because he had exhausted every other option and was currently fearing for his physical safety. I set my coffee cup down on the marble table. I tapped the call button. The line did not even ring a full time before he answered. "Abby." "Oh, thank God." Derek gasped into the receiver, his voice tight and breathless with panic. "I knew you would call back. Please tell me you can send an Uber for me. I am freezing. I have not eaten in 2 days. I just need a place to crash until I can figure out how to get out of the city. They are looking for me, Abby. The debt collectors went to Kendra's corporate office. I need cash." I let him ramble for 10 seconds, letting the sheer weight of his entitlement hang in the air. "Derek," I said. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, calm, absolute authority of someone who had entirely detached from the situation. He stopped talking instantly, waiting for me to offer him a lifeline. "You sat at a Thanksgiving dinner table and slid a fake psychiatric evaluation onto my plate." I continued my words, slicing through the static on the line. You watched your wife smash a glass door, cut her own arm open, and frame me for a violent felony. You looked a federal judge in the eye and swore I was insane because you wanted to use my inheritance to cover up your own massive financial failures. Abby. I had no choice, Derek sobbed, the sound pathetic and hollow. Kendra's family threatened me. They said they would ruin me if I did not go along with the conservatorship. I was terrified of them. I was just trying to survive. You are a coward, I stated, stripping away his final excuse. You were not trying to survive. You were trying to maintain your luxury penthouse and your designer suits, and you were perfectly willing to sell your own sister to a psychiatric asylum to keep them. You threw me to the wolves, Derek. You just did not realize I knew how to hunt. I am sorry, he cried. I will do whatever you want. I will go to a gambling rehabilitation center. I will pay you back every single cent. Just do not leave me out here. You are my family. I looked up at the television screens above the espresso bar, watching the news footage of his wife being led away in an orange jumpsuit. I felt absolutely nothing but peace. Derek, you watched them try to lock me in a psych ward to steal my life. You do not have a sister anymore. I did not wait for his response. I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. I tapped his contact profile and pressed the block button. A small prompt appeared on the screen asking if I was sure I wanted to stop receiving communications from this caller. I pressed confirm. I opened my contact list again. I found the number for Patricia, the mother who had stolen my college fund, and testified that I was an ungrateful monster. I pressed block. I found the number for Richard, the father who had crawled on his knees begging for a loan after watching his retirement fund vanish into federal custody. I pressed block. I secured my phone, finished the last sip of my coffee, and walked out into the brisk morning air. I did not go to a hotel. I went straight to my secure high-rise apartment. I walked into the hallway closet and pulled out a small worn cardboard box. It was the only box I had not unpacked since returning from my military deployment. Inside were the few tangible pieces of my childhood. A faded photograph from a family vacation where my parents were smiling brightly at Derek while I stood awkwardly at the edge of the frame. A high school graduation picture where my mother was looking at her watch instead of looking at me. They were not memories of a loving family. They were evidence of a lifelong emotional starvation. They were anchors to a past that no longer had any power over me. I closed the flaps of the cardboard box. I carried it out of my apartment and took the service elevator down to the basement loading dock of the building. The concrete room was cold and smelled of damp industrial cleaner. I walked over to the massive green metal dumpster. I lifted the heavy lid, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. I held the box over the opening for a single second. I did not cry. I did not feel a pang of regret. I dropped the box into the darkness. It hit the bottom with a dull, hollow thud. I slammed the heavy metal lid shut. The toxic roots were severed once and for all. The people who had tried to destroy me were officially erased from my existence. I turned around and walked back to the elevator, my tactical boots stepping lightly on the concrete. I had an appointment to keep. 30 minutes later, I unlocked the glass door of my newly leased commercial office space. The suite was located on the 30th floor of a beautiful glass and steel building right in the center of the financial district. The walls smelled of fresh paint. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine hardwood floors. The space was a blank canvas, representing the absolute freedom I had just secured for myself. I set my briefcase on the sleek, modern reception desk and looked out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. I had defended my honor, protected my inheritance, and dismantled a corrupt syndicate from the inside out. I had won. A sharp, authoritative knock sounded on the frosted glass of my office door. My new life was about to begin. "Come in," I called out, my voice steady and commanding. The frosted glass door swung open. It had been exactly 6 months since I stood in this room when it was nothing but bare floors and fresh paint. Now the space was entirely transformed. I turned away from the floor-to-ceiling windows and walked over to my massive mahogany desk, running my hand along the polished edge. Beyond the glass walls of my private office, my elite team of investigators and analysts were hard at work. The hum of high-stakes financial operations filled the suite. I had taken full uncontested control of my $4 million inheritance and used a fraction of it to launch Mitchell forensic investigations right in the heart of the Chicago financial district. My firm had rapidly become the premier agency for dismantling complex corporate fraud. I did not just survive my family's betrayal, I weaponized the skills I used to defeat them and built my own legitimate, unbreakable empire. I sat down in my high-backed leather executive chair. I had not looked back a single time. I never unblocked their phone numbers. I never checked my email for their desperate apologies. I refused to entertain the societal expectation of toxic forgiveness. Some betrayals are absolute, and severing those ties is the only path to true peace. I read the local news updates like everyone else in the city. Kendra was currently sitting in a federal detention center without bail, awaiting trial for a massive laundry list of financial crimes. Her father had taken a plea deal that required him to liquidate his remaining commercial properties to pay back the Internal Revenue Service. Derek was completely bankrupt, his whereabouts unknown, and entirely irrelevant to me. My parents were forced to vacate their home and move into a tiny, cramped rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. Their retirement fund was permanently seized by the government as proceeds of a federal crime. They had traded their own daughter for a taste of high society, and they had ended up with absolutely nothing. Former Judge Thomas Arrington had been formally disbarred and was facing 20 years in federal prison for accepting bribes. The dominoes had fallen exactly as I designed them to. I turned around in my chair and looked at the wall directly behind my desk. I had hired a professional archivist to frame my credentials. My certified public accountant license and my certified in financial forensics certificate hung in sleek, modern black frames. They represented my brilliant, razor-sharp mind. But right in the center, perfectly illuminated by a small overhead spotlight, was a heavy glass shadow box. Resting on a bed of dark velvet was my bronze navy cross. The metal gleamed in the morning light. It was no longer a piece of evidence used to fight off a corrupt psychiatric hold in a rigged courtroom. It was a daily visceral reminder of exactly who I was. I had saved lives on a burning battlefield in Syria, and I had slaughtered a corrupt dynasty in Chicago. The military hero and the financial predator hunter were not two different people. They were merged into one unstoppable force. The man who had knocked on my door stepped fully into my office. It was Special Agent Reynolds. He was not wearing his heavy tactical vest or his FBI windbreaker today. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, holding a thick classified manila folder in his large hand. We had stayed in close contact over the last 6 months. My firm had become a highly classified independent contractor for federal task forces tracking complex white-collar crimes. I had the specialized skills to bypass corporate firewalls and decode shadow ledgers that traditional law enforcement struggled to untangle. I tracked the dirty money, and Reynolds brought the tactical strike force to arrest the people hiding it. We were a perfect lethal combination. Reynolds closed the glass door behind him and walked over to my desk. He looked at the framed Navy cross on the wall and gave it a brief, deeply respectful nod before looking back at me. He dropped the heavy manila folder squarely onto the center of my desk. It landed with a satisfying, heavy thud. "Good morning, Abby," Agent Reynolds said, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. "We have a new case, a corrupt billionaire operating out of New York. He is hiding dark money in a massive labyrinth of offshore shell companies. He thinks his political connections make him completely untouchable by the justice system." Reynolds tapped his index finger against the top of the classified folder. "The Bureau needs a specialist to crack his internal ledgers and pull the secondary verification layers. Are you interested?" I looked down at the thick stack of confidential documents resting on my mahogany desk. I thought about the people in this world who believed their immense wealth allowed them to manipulate the law, destroy innocent lives, and operate without consequence. I thought about the absolute pure satisfaction of tearing down their arrogant facades piece by piece and handing their secrets over to the federal government. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on top of the folder. I stood up straight, squaring my shoulders with flawless military posture and casually adjusted the lapels of my perfectly tailored navy blue blazer. "Bring them on," I said, a cold, confident smile spreading across my face. I love watching empires fall. The most profound lesson from this story is that true power does not stem from bloodlines or inherited wealth. It comes from absolute, unshakable self-reliance. When her own parents and brother chose greed over her freedom, she did not wait for an apology or seek toxic forgiveness. Instead, she used her intelligence to dismantle their corruption and build her own empire. She proved that establishing firm boundaries is an act of essential self-preservation. You owe nothing to those who view your destruction as collateral damage. If you have ever walked away from toxic relatives, share your story and comment below.